Welcome back to The Sleep Detective. Tonight, we embark on perhaps our most psychologically complex journey yet into the mind of John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. Over the next 3 hours, we'll explore how a man could simultaneously serve as a respected community leader, successful businessman, and beloved children's entertainer while secretly torturing and murdering 33 young men beneath his suburban Chicago home. This isn't simply about a serial killer who wore clown makeup, but about the sophisticated psychology of compartmentalization that allowed someone to maintain two completely separate identities, one beloved by his community, the other capable of unthinkable evil. Before we begin this comprehensive exploration into one of criminal psychology's most disturbing cases of dual personality, I want you to consider what draws us to understand minds capable of such complete deception. There's something both terrifying and fascinating about individuals who can seamlessly transition between normalcy and monstrosity. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. If you find value in these detailed psychological analyses, subscribing helps us continue exploring the most complex corners of human psychology. Tonight's journey will take us through the creation of public personas, the psychology of community manipulation, and the mental mechanisms that enable ordinary-seeming people to commit extraordinary evil. John Wayne Gacy, Jr.B., was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, to parents whose troubled relationship would create the psychological foundation for his later development of multiple, contradictory personalities. From the very beginning, John's childhood was marked by a complex dynamic between his desire for approval and his father's harsh, often violent rejection. His father, John Stanley Gacy Sr., was an alcoholic who frequently beat his children and wife, while simultaneously demanding perfect behavior and conventional success from his family members. The psychology of John's relationship with his father reveals how early emotional trauma can create powerful drives for external validation and social acceptance. Unlike Jeffrey Dahmer, whose response to childhood trauma was withdrawal and isolation, John's psychological adaptation involved developing an external persona designed to win the approval and admiration that his father had consistently denied him. This fundamental difference in trauma response would shape their entirely different approaches to both life and criminal behavior. John's earliest psychological development was characterized by his desperate need to present himself as successful, likable, and socially valuable, even when his internal emotional state was chaotic and damaged. His childhood efforts to gain his father's approval through academic achievement, social popularity, and conventional success created psychological patterns that would persist throughout his adult life, driving him to construct elaborate public personas that masked his true psychological state. The psychology of John's early social development reveals someone who quickly learned that external performance and social manipulation could provide the validation and control that he couldn't achieve through genuine emotional connections. His childhood friendships, school relationships, and community involvement all showed patterns of calculated charm and strategic self-presentation designed to create specific impressions rather than authentic human connections. John's discovery of his homosexuality during adolescence created profound psychological conflicts in someone whose entire identity was built around gaining social approval and conventional success. Growing up in the conservative 1950s, his sexual orientation represented not just personal shame, but a fundamental threat to the public persona he had constructed to compensate for his childhood emotional trauma. This conflict would become central to his psychological development and criminal behavior. The psychology of John's response to his sexual identity reveals how individuals can develop sophisticated systems of denial and compartmentalization when core aspects of their identity conflict with their social goals. rather than accepting his homosexuality and adjusting his social strategy. John chose to deny and suppress this aspect of himself while simultaneously acting on it in secret, creating the foundation for the dual life psychology that would characterize his entire adult existence. John's academic and social success during high school reflected his growing sophistication in creating and maintaining public personas that served his psychological needs for validation and social control. His involvement in student government, social organizations, and community activities all showed someone who had learned to weaponize charm and social skills to achieve specific psychological goals rather than genuine social connection. The psychology of John's early romantic relationships reveals patterns of manipulation and performance that would characterize all of his subsequent personal connections. His dating relationships with women weren't driven by genuine attraction or emotional connection, but by his need to maintain his public image and deny his homosexual impulses. These relationships served as psychological props in his elaborate performance of conventional normalcy. John's marriage to Marlon Myers in 1964 represents a crucial development in his psychology of compartmentalization and social performance. His ability to maintain the role of devoted husband while secretly engaging in homosexual encounters shows how completely he had learned to separate different aspects of his identity and behavior. This marriage wasn't a genuine emotional partnership, but a carefully constructed element of his public persona. The psychology of John's early business career reveals someone who approached professional success with the same calculated manipulation that characterized all of his social relationships. His involvement in various business ventures, his community leadership roles, and his political activities all showed patterns of strategic self-presentation designed to build the public image he needed rather than pursue genuine professional interests or goals. John's involvement in Democratic Party politics during the 1960s and early 1970s reveals how his need for social validation and control had evolved into sophisticated community manipulation. His work on political campaigns, his networking with local officials, and his participation in civic organizations all served to build the public reputation that provided psychological protection for his secret activities and internal conflicts. The psychology of John's relationship with his children from his first marriage reveals complex patterns where his genuine affection for them coexisted with his use of them as props in his public persona. His role as a father served multiple psychological functions. It provided evidence of his conventional normalcy, satisfied his need for control and authority, and offered opportunities for the genuine emotional connection that was largely absent from his adult relationships. John's business success with Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises during the late 1960s represents the peak of his public persona development, showing someone who had successfully created a community identity as a successful businessman, devoted father, and civic leader. This professional achievement provided the social status and financial resources that would later enable his criminal activities while providing psychological validation for his public performance. The psychology of John's community involvement during this period reveals how completely he had learned to use social manipulation and public service to create protective camouflage for his true psychological state. His participation in the JCs, his civic leadership roles, and his charitable activities all served to build a public reputation that would make future accusations against him seem incredible to those who knew his public persona. John's first known criminal behavior, involving sexual assault of teenage employees at his restaurant, reveals how his carefully constructed public persona enabled predatory behavior by creating positions of authority and trust that he could exploit. His victims' reluctance to report his crimes shows how effectively his public reputation served as psychological armor against accusations and consequences. The psychology of John's response to his first criminal charges in Iowa reveals someone whose entire identity was so dependent on his public persona that legal trouble created profound psychological crisis. His strategies for managing the crisis, including manipulation of legal proceedings and attempts to maintain his public image, show how completely his psychology had become organized around external validation and social control. John's brief imprisonment in Iowa for sexual assault represents a crucial psychological turning point where his public persona was temporarily destroyed, forcing him to confront the reality of his hidden impulses and behaviors. His psychological response to incarceration involved not genuine self-reflection or behavior modification, but strategic planning for rebuilding his public image and developing better concealment methods for his criminal activities. The psychology of John's release from prison and his subsequent move to Chicago reveals someone who had learned crucial lessons about maintaining his dual identity more effectively. His decision to relocate, his strategies for rebuilding his public reputation, and his development of more sophisticated criminal methods all show how his prison experience had strengthened rather than reformed his criminal psychology. John's purchase of the house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in 1968 represents the creation of his ideal psychological environment, where he could maintain his public persona while having complete privacy for his criminal activities. The house would become both the headquarters for his legitimate business operations and the burial ground for his victims, representing the ultimate expression of his compartmentalized psychology. The psychology of how John organized his domestic space reveals someone who had created a physical environment that supported his dual identity, with public areas designed to reinforce his conventional image and private areas modified to facilitate his criminal activities. His home renovation projects, his entertaining strategies, and his neighbor relationships all show sophisticated planning for maintaining his psychological compartmentalization. John's second marriage to Carol Hoff in 1972 represents his most sophisticated attempt to use a romantic relationship as camouflage for his true psychological state and criminal activities. His ability to maintain the role of husband while simultaneously engaging in serial murder shows how completely his psychology had adapted to managing multiple, contradictory identities within the same living space. The psychology of John's relationship with his stepchildren reveals complex patterns where his genuine care for them coexisted with his use of them as alibis and props in his public persona. His role as stepfather provided additional evidence of his conventional normalcy while creating practical cover for his criminal activities through the family routines and social obligations that explained his presence at home during evening hours. Understanding John Wayne Gacy's early psychology reveals how childhood trauma and social pressure can create individuals whose entire existence becomes organized around maintaining false personas that hide their true psychological state. Unlike other serial killers who withdraw from society, John's response was to become hypersocial, using community involvement and public service to create protective camouflage for criminal behavior. The dual life we've begun to explore tonight reveals John Gacy as someone whose sophisticated understanding of social manipulation and community psychology enabled him to commit horrific crimes while maintaining a beloved public image. His case demonstrates how the most dangerous individuals may be those who appear most normal and socially integrated, using their public personas as weapons against potential victims and protective shields against detection. The psychological foundation we've examined provides crucial context for understanding how John would eventually murder 33 young men while maintaining his role as a respected community leader and children's entertainer. His early development of compartmentalization skills and social manipulation techniques created the framework for one of criminal history's most disturbing examples of hidden evil operating within normal society. The mind we've begun to explore tonight represents perhaps the most sophisticated example of criminal compartmentalization ever documented, showing how psychological trauma can drive individuals to create elaborate false identities that enable them to function successfully in society while secretly engaging in repeated acts of extreme violence. As we continue our journey, we'll see how these early patterns evolved into the systematic killing career that would eventually claim 33 innocent lives. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of his complex personality, his creation and performance as Pogo the Clown. This wasn't simply a hobby or side business, but a sophisticated psychological construction that served multiple functions in his compartmentalized mind. Understanding the psychology behind John's clown persona reveals how performance and theatrical masks can become tools for both social manipulation and internal psychological management, allowing individuals to express hidden aspects of their personality while maintaining protective distance from their true selves. The psychology of John's initial interest in clown performance reveals someone who was drawn to an art form that literally involved wearing masks and assuming false identities. His discovery of clowning during the early 1970s came at a time when his dual life was becoming increasingly complex and psychologically demanding. The clown persona offered a legitimate outlet for his sophisticated understanding of performance and deception while providing new opportunities for community validation and social control. John's development of his Pogo the Clown character represents one of the most psychologically significant creations in criminal history, serving as both public entertainment and private psychological expression. The name Pogo itself reveals important psychological insights. It was derived from patches combined with bozo, suggesting someone who was consciously creating a hybrid identity that combined different clown traditions while remaining distinctly his own creation. The psychology of John's clown costume design reveals sophisticated understanding of visual psychology and audience manipulation. His choice of bright colors, exaggerated features, and specific makeup patterns all show someone who understood how costume and appearance could create desired emotional responses in viewers. The costume served as literal armor that protected his true identity while enabling intimate interaction with potential victims. John's performance style as Pogo reveals complex psychological patterns where his natural charisma and manipulation skills found legitimate expression through entertainment. His ability to engage children and adults, his understanding of crowd psychology, and his skill at reading audience responses all show how his predatory instincts could be channeled into socially acceptable performance art that enhanced rather than threatened his public reputation. The psychology of John's relationship with his clown identity reveals someone who had found the perfect psychological vehicle for expressing hidden aspects of his personality while maintaining complete deniability about their true meaning. As Pogo, he could be playful, mischievous, and slightly transgressive in ways that his public persona as a businessman and civic leader couldn't accommodate, providing psychological relief from the constraints of his carefully constructed normal identity. John's use of clown performance for charitable events and community functions reveals how completely he had learned to weaponize entertainment and public service for his psychological needs. His appearances at children's hospitals, community festivals, and political events all served to enhance his public reputation while providing cover for his criminal activities and satisfying his need for attention and social control. The psychology of how John's clown persona enabled access to potential victims reveals the predatory calculation behind what appeared to be innocent entertainment. His performances at community events brought him into contact with families and young people while establishing his reputation as someone who cared about children and community welfare. This access was crucial to his later victim acquisition strategies, John's painting of clown portraits during his later years reveals how the clown identity had become a permanent part of his psychological landscape, providing ongoing connection to the performance aspects of his personality even when actual performance was no longer possible. These paintings weren't just artistic expression, but psychological documents that revealed his continued identification with the masked performative aspects of his identity. The psychology of John's clown makeup application reveals sophisticated understanding of transformation and identity construction. His careful attention to detail, his consistency in appearance, and his ritualistic approach to costume preparation all show someone who understood that becoming Pogo involved psychological as well as physical transformation. The makeup process served as a transition ritual that enabled him to access different aspects of his personality. John's interaction with other clowns and entertainment professionals reveals how his performance persona enabled genuine social connections that his normal identity couldn't achieve. His participation in clown organizations, his mentoring of other performers, and his development of professional relationships all show how the clown identity provided authentic social engagement that was absent from his carefully constructed business and civic relationships. The psychology of John's clown performance schedule reveals how entertainment activities were integrated into his overall life management strategy, providing alibis for his time and explaining his presence at various locations throughout the community. His booking calendar, his transportation routines, and his equipment management all show someone who was using legitimate performance activities to support illegitimate criminal planning. John's development of multiple clown characters beyond Pogo reveals psychological complexity that went beyond simple entertainment to encompass exploration of different personality aspects through performance. His various character variations allowed him to express different emotional states and psychological needs while maintaining the protective distance provided by costume and makeup. The psychology of John's audience relationships as Pogo reveals how performance enabled him to experience genuine positive emotions and social connection while maintaining complete control over the interaction parameters. His ability to bring joy to children and adults provided psychological satisfaction that was absent from his other relationships, where manipulation and deception were constant requirements for maintaining his personas. John's use of clown performance to manage his internal psychological state reveals how entertainment activities serve therapeutic functions by providing socially acceptable outlets for aspects of his personality that couldn't be expressed through his business or civic roles. The performance allowed him to be playful, creative, and emotionally expressive in ways that his other identities required him to suppress. The psychology of how John's clown identity influenced his approach to his criminal activities reveals disturbing connections between his performance skills and his predatory behavior. His understanding of costume, makeup, and character development all provided tools that he could apply to victim manipulation and crime scene management, while his performance experience enhanced his ability to read and manipulate human emotional responses. John's photographs and videos of his clown performances reveal someone who was carefully documenting and studying his own performance effectiveness, using media recording to analyze and improve his character development and audience manipulation techniques. This documentation also provided ongoing psychological satisfaction by allowing him to relive successful performance experiences and social validation. The psychology of John's clown persona in relation to his business activities reveals how entertainment performance became integrated into his overall strategy for community influence and reputation management. His clown appearances at business events, political functions, and civic organizations all serve to enhance his professional standing while providing psychological satisfaction from performance and audience control. John's teaching of clown techniques to others reveals psychological patterns where sharing his performance knowledge provided additional validation and social control while expanding his influence within the entertainment community. His mentoring relationships allowed him to position himself as an expert and authority figure while building networks that supported his overall reputation management strategy. The psychology of John's clown costume and equipment storage reveals how performance materials became integrated into his domestic environment alongside criminal tools and victim remains. His organization of costumes, makeup, and props shows someone who was managing multiple complex identities within the same physical space, requiring sophisticated compartmentalization and planning abilities. John's use of clown performance for stress management reveals how entertainment activities serve psychological functions beyond simple social manipulation to encompass emotional regulation and mental health maintenance. His performance schedule often intensified during periods of high stress, suggesting that the clown identity provided psychological relief from the pressures of maintaining his dual life. Understanding the psychology of John's clown persona reveals how performance and entertainment can become sophisticated tools for psychological management and social manipulation when used by individuals with complex personality disorders. His case shows how creative expression can serve both positive and negative psychological functions, providing legitimate outlets for hidden personality aspects while enabling predatory behavior. The clown identity we've examined tonight represents one of the most psychologically complex performance personas ever documented, showing how entertainment and art can become weapons in the hands of sophisticated manipulators. John's use of Pogo the Clown reveals the disturbing potential for performance skills to serve criminal purposes while providing psychological benefits that make dangerous behavior more sustainable. The psychology of John's relationship with his clown identity challenges assumptions about the relationship between creative expression and mental health, showing how performance can serve both therapeutic and predatory functions simultaneously. His case demonstrates the importance of understanding the full psychological context of individual behavior rather than assuming that creative activities necessarily indicate positive mental health. The performance psychology we've analyzed provides crucial insights into how John was able to maintain his complex dual life while building the community relationships that would later provide protection from suspicion when victims began disappearing. His clown persona represents the ultimate expression of his ability to use charm and entertainment to manipulate social relationships for criminal purposes. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his clown persona provides essential context for examining how he used his various public identities to facilitate victim acquisition and avoid detection. The mask we've analyzed tonight was both literal and metaphorical, representing his sophisticated understanding of how performance could serve criminal purposes while providing genuine psychological satisfaction. The psychological complexity we've revealed shows John as someone whose creative abilities and performance skills were completely integrated into his criminal psychology, making his entertainment activities inseparable from his predatory behavior. His case demonstrates how the most dangerous individuals may be those whose talents and social skills enable them to hide in plain sight while using their abilities to facilitate rather than prevent criminal behavior. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine one of the most psychologically sophisticated aspects of his criminal strategy: his systematic use of legitimate business success and professional achievement as camouflage for his predatory activities. Unlike many serial killers who struggle with conventional success or withdraw from normal society, John deliberately cultivated an image of prosperity, community leadership, and business acumen that served as powerful psychological armor against suspicion. Understanding how he weaponized success reveals the disturbing potential for professional achievement to become a tool of manipulation and concealment when wielded by individuals with complex criminal psychology. The psychology of John's approach to business success reveals someone who understood that financial prosperity and professional recognition could provide not just social status, but actual protection from criminal investigation. His systematic building of business reputation wasn't motivated solely by profit or personal satisfaction, but served crucial functions in his overall criminal strategy. This calculated use of legitimate achievement shows how sophisticated criminals can exploit society's assumptions about the relationship between success and moral character. John's initial entry into the restaurant business through Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises represents a psychologically significant choice that reveals his understanding of how certain types of businesses could serve his dual purposes. The restaurant industry provided legitimate cover for the irregular hours, cash transactions, and employee management that would later facilitate his criminal activities. His selection of this particular business model shows strategic thinking about how legitimate operations could support illegitimate goals. The psychology of John's management style in his legitimate businesses reveals patterns of control, manipulation, and exploitation that would later characterize his criminal behavior. His approach to employee relations, his hiring practices, and his workplace discipline all show someone who was using legitimate authority relationships to practice and refine the psychological techniques he would later apply to victim selection and control. His business operations served as training grounds for predatory behavior. John's financial management and business expansion strategies reveal sophisticated understanding of how wealth accumulation could provide both psychological satisfaction and practical criminal support. His careful attention to cash flow, his strategic property investments, and his expansion into multiple business ventures all show someone who was building the financial resources necessary to support an increasingly complex dual life while creating legitimate explanations for unusual expenses and activities. The psychology of John's relationship with business partners and associates reveals how he used professional relationships to build networks of character references and alibi providers who could vouch for his character and activities. His cultivation of business friendships, his participation in professional organizations, and his strategic networking all served to create a web of legitimate social connections that would later provide protection against criminal suspicion. John's approach to customer relations and public interaction through his businesses reveals sophisticated understanding of how commercial success could be leveraged to build community reputation and social influence. His attention to customer satisfaction, his community involvement through business activities, and his use of commercial success to gain civic recognition all show someone who was systematically building the public image that would later protect him from serious criminal investigation. The psychology of John's business location choices and property management reveals strategic thinking about how legitimate real estate could support criminal activities while maintaining the appearance of normal commercial operations. His selection of properties, his renovation projects, and his use of business locations for both legitimate and criminal purposes all show careful planning about how to integrate his dual life within the same physical and geographical spaces. John's approach to business licensing, legal compliance, and regulatory relationships reveals how he used legitimate bureaucratic processes to establish official documentation of his respectable citizen status. His careful attention to permits, taxes, and business regulations all served to create paper trails that supported his public persona while providing practical cover for activities that required official legitimacy and community standing. The psychology of John's business communication and marketing strategies reveals how he used legitimate promotional activities to practice and refine the psychological manipulation techniques that would later be applied to victim acquisition. His advertising approaches, his customer interaction training, and his public relations efforts all provided opportunities to study and improve his understanding of how to influence and control other people's perceptions and decisions. John's employment practices and worker management reveal disturbing patterns where his legitimate authority over employees provided opportunities to identify, groom, and exploit vulnerable individuals who would later become victims of his criminal activities. His hiring preferences, his employee evaluation methods, and his workplace social dynamics all show how business operations became hunting grounds for potential victims while providing legitimate explanations for his contact with young men. The psychology of John's business, financial records, and accounting practices reveals sophisticated understanding of how legitimate bookkeeping could provide cover for criminal expenses while maintaining the documentation necessary to support his public image of financial responsibility and business success. His approach to expense management, tax preparation, and financial reporting all show careful attention to maintaining legitimate appearances while accommodating illegitimate activities. John's participation in business organizations and professional associations reveals how he used legitimate networking opportunities to build the social connections that would later provide character references and alibi support when criminal investigations began. His involvement in chambers of commerce, business clubs, and professional societies all served to expand his network of respectable associates who would find criminal accusations incredible. The psychology of John's business crisis management and problem-solving approaches reveals how he used legitimate business challenges to practice and refine the psychological techniques that would later be applied to criminal crisis management. His handling of employee problems, customer complaints, and business emergencies all provided opportunities to develop and test the manipulation and deception skills that would become crucial for maintaining his criminal activities. John's approach to business expansion and growth strategies reveals long-term psychological planning about how increasing success and visibility could provide enhanced protection from criminal suspicion while supporting increasingly complex criminal operations. His strategic business planning shows someone who was thinking years ahead about how legitimate achievement could be leveraged to support illegitimate activities. The psychology of John's business partnership negotiations and contract management reveals sophisticated understanding of how legitimate legal relationships could provide both practical support and psychological validation for his public persona. His approach to business agreements, partnership structures, and contractual obligations all show someone who is using legitimate business relationships to build the foundation of respectability that would later protect his criminal activities. John's use of business success for political networking and civic influence reveals how professional achievement became a tool for building relationships with law enforcement, local officials, and community leaders who would later be reluctant to investigate or believe criminal accusations against someone they knew. As a successful businessman and community contributor, his strategic cultivation of political connections shows sophisticated understanding of how legitimate influence could provide criminal protection. The psychology of John's business, public relations, and community involvement reveals how he used commercial success as a platform for building the kind of public reputation that would make criminal accusations seem implausible to those who knew him through his business activities. His charitable contributions, community sponsorships, and public service through business activities all serve to create the image of civic responsibility that would later protect him from serious criminal investigation. John's approach to business documentation and record-keeping reveals careful attention to maintaining the kind of detailed, legitimate records that would support his public image, while providing explanations for activities, expenses, and relationships that might otherwise appear suspicious to investigators. His systematic approach to business administration shows someone who understood that thorough, legitimate documentation could provide cover for illegitimate activities. The psychology of John's business equipment and resource management reveals how legitimate commercial operations provided access to tools, materials, and facilities that would later be used for criminal purposes. His business purchases, equipment maintenance, and facility management all show how legitimate business operations could provide practical support for illegitimate activities while maintaining plausible explanations for unusual acquisitions or modifications. John's approach to business insurance and risk management reveals sophisticated understanding of how legitimate protection and liability coverage could provide both practical and psychological security for someone engaged in high-risk criminal activities. His attention to business protection strategies shows someone who is thinking comprehensively about how to minimize both legitimate and illegitimate risks to his operations. The psychology of John's business succession planning and long-term strategy reveals how he was building legitimate enterprises that could continue operating and supporting his public image even if his criminal activities required periods of reduced visibility or increased caution. His attention to business sustainability shows strategic thinking about how legitimate operations could provide ongoing support for criminal psychology and activities. John's use of business success for family and social relationship management reveals how professional achievement provided both practical and psychological tools for maintaining the personal relationships that supported his public persona. His ability to provide financial support, social status, and community recognition to family members and friends all serve to build the network of personal loyalty that would later protect him from serious investigation. The psychology of John's business competitive strategies and market positioning reveals how he approached legitimate commercial competition with the same psychological techniques that characterized his criminal activities. His understanding of market manipulation, customer psychology, and competitive advantage all show how business success and criminal behavior were integrated aspects of the same underlying psychological approach to control and dominance. John's approach to business technology and innovation reveals how he stayed current with commercial developments that could enhance both his legitimate operations and his criminal capabilities. His adoption of new business technologies, communication systems, and operational methods all show someone who is constantly seeking ways to improve both aspects of his dual life through legitimate business advancement. Understanding the psychology of John's business success reveals how legitimate achievement can become a sophisticated weapon in the hands of individuals with criminal intent. His case demonstrates that professional success and community recognition don't necessarily indicate moral character or eliminate criminal potential, but can actually provide enhanced opportunities and protection for criminal activities when combined with sophisticated psychological manipulation abilities. The business psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone who understood that in American society, financial success and professional achievement could provide almost impenetrable protection against criminal suspicion. His systematic cultivation of business reputation represents one of the most sophisticated criminal camouflage strategies ever documented, showing how legitimate accomplishment can be weaponized to support illegitimate activities. The entrepreneurial success we've analyzed challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between conventional achievement and criminal behavior, demonstrating that business acumen and community leadership can coexist with extreme antisocial pathology when managed by individuals with sufficient psychological sophistication and compartmentalization abilities. John's integration of legitimate business operations with criminal activities represents a level of strategic planning and risk management that distinguishes his approach from most serial killers who struggle with conventional success or operate on the margins of society. His case shows how the most dangerous criminals may be those who achieve rather than fail at conventional social and economic goals. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his business success provides crucial context for examining how he used professional achievement and financial prosperity to facilitate victim acquisition, avoid detection, and maintain the community relationships that would later provide protection when criminal investigations began. His legitimate success became the foundation for illegitimate activities that would ultimately claim 33 innocent lives. The sophisticated business psychology we've revealed tonight shows how professional achievement and financial success, when combined with criminal intent and psychological manipulation abilities, can create perfect storms of opportunity and protection that enable sustained criminal careers. John's case demonstrates the crucial importance of understanding that conventional success markers don't eliminate criminal potential, but can actually enhance criminal capabilities when wielded by individuals with antisocial psychology and strategic planning abilities. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine perhaps the most crucial transformation in his criminal development: the transition from sexual assault and manipulation to systematic murder. Unlike Jeffrey Dahmer, whose first kill was driven by fear of abandonment and rejection, John's progression to murder was characterized by calculated escalation of his control obsessions and the growing conflict between his public personas and his hidden sexual desires. Understanding this psychological threshold reveals how someone with sophisticated social skills and community standing could cross the ultimate moral boundary while maintaining their carefully constructed public image. The psychology of John's transition from non-lethal criminal behavior to murder reveals someone whose escalating need for control and dominance had outgrown the satisfaction provided by sexual assault and psychological manipulation alone. His early criminal activities in Iowa, involving the sexual abuse of teenage employees, had provided temporary psychological satisfaction but left witnesses who could potentially threaten his carefully constructed public image. The progression to murder represents his psychological solution to the problem of victim testimony and his growing need for absolute control over his criminal encounters. John's first known murder, believed to have occurred in early 1968, represents a crucial psychological threshold that was crossed not in a moment of passion or panic, but through calculated decision-making about how to manage the risks and psychological needs that his criminal behavior was creating. Unlike serial killers who begin with impulsive violence, John's first murder appears to have been a strategic evolution of his existing criminal psychology, designed to eliminate the witness problem while satisfying his escalating control obsessions. The psychology of John's victim selection for his first murders reveals sophisticated understanding of social vulnerability and community blind spots that his business success and civic involvement had taught him to recognize and exploit. His targeting of young men who were socially marginalized, economically vulnerable, or disconnected from family support systems shows someone who was applying market research and business analysis techniques to criminal victim acquisition, using his legitimate community knowledge to identify prey. John's approach methods for his early victims reveal how his established social manipulation skills and public reputation provided unprecedented access to potential targets while minimizing their natural defensive responses. His ability to present himself as a successful businessman offering employment opportunities, his use of his clown persona to establish rapport with young people, and his exploitation of his community standing to gain victim trust all show how legitimate success could be weaponized for criminal purposes. The psychology of John's early killing methods reveals someone who was applying problem-solving and risk management skills developed through business success to the logistics of murder and body disposal. His use of ligature strangulation, his attention to crime scene control, and his systematic approach to evidence elimination all show careful planning and methodical execution that characterized his business operations. These early murders weren't crimes of passion but calculated implementations of carefully developed criminal strategies. John's psychological response to his first successful murders reveals patterns that distinguish his criminal psychology from other serial killers, who often experience guilt, panic, or psychological crisis after crossing the murder threshold. His apparent emotional detachment from the killing process, combined with his continued ability to maintain his public personas and business operations, shows sophisticated compartmentalization abilities that had been developed through years of managing his dual identity conflicts. The psychology of John's body disposal methods for his early victims reveals how his property ownership and construction knowledge provided practical solutions to concealment challenges while serving deeper psychological needs for possession and control. His decision to bury victims on his property rather than disposing of them elsewhere shows someone whose murders were driven by ownership obsessions rather than simple elimination of witnesses. The victims weren't just killed, but claimed as permanent possessions. John's ability to continue his normal social and business activities immediately after his first murders reveals compartmentalization skills that enabled him to separate his criminal psychology from his public performance without apparent psychological conflict or behavioral changes that might alert others to his activities. His continued civic involvement, business operations, and social relationships all proceeded normally while he was simultaneously beginning his career as a serial killer. The psychology of John's escalation pattern after his first successful murders reveals how the psychological satisfaction derived from complete control and permanent possession created addictive cycles that demanded increasingly frequent repetition. Unlike killers driven by rage or sexual compulsion, John's murders appear to have served complex psychological functions related to power, control, and the resolution of identity conflicts that made killing psychologically necessary rather than simply desired. John's development of victim acquisition routines and criminal operational procedures reveals someone who was applying the same systematic business management principles to murder that had made his legitimate enterprises successful. His standardization of approach methods, his refinement of killing techniques, and his optimization of disposal procedures all show someone who was treating murder as a business process requiring continuous improvement and efficiency optimization. The psychology of John's criminal planning and scheduling reveals how murder became integrated into his legitimate calendar and routine activities without creating conflicts or inconsistencies that might compromise his public image. His ability to plan criminal activities around business obligations, social commitments, and family responsibilities shows sophisticated time management skills that enabled sustainable criminal operations within an otherwise conventional lifestyle. John's use of his multiple public personas to facilitate victim acquisition reveals how his clown character, business reputation, and civic involvement each provided different types of access to potential victims while creating layered explanations for his presence in various social contexts. His ability to shift between identities depending on victim type and situation shows psychological flexibility that made him particularly dangerous and difficult to detect. The psychology of John's relationship management during his early killing period reveals how his murders were creating new psychological pressures that required increasingly sophisticated social manipulation to manage without arousing suspicion. His interactions with his wife, business associates, and community contacts all required careful performance to maintain normal appearances while accommodating the psychological changes that killing was creating in his internal mental state. John's approach to criminal risk management during his early murders reveals sophisticated understanding of law enforcement procedures and community response patterns that his civic involvement and political connections had provided. His knowledge of police investigation methods, his understanding of missing person procedures, and his awareness of community concern patterns all informed his criminal planning and victim selection strategies. The psychology of John's victim interaction patterns reveals how his established manipulation skills were adapted to create specific psychological dynamics that served both his sexual desires and his control obsessions. His ability to establish rapport with victims, his techniques for reducing their defensive responses, and his methods for maintaining control throughout criminal encounters all show refined predatory skills that had been developed through legitimate social and business interactions. John's construction and renovation activities during his early killing period reveal how legitimate home improvement projects provided both practical support for body disposal and psychological satisfaction from literally building the infrastructure for his criminal activities. His excavation of his crawl space, his modification of his property, drainage, and his installation of ventilation systems all served dual purposes that integrated his legitimate and criminal activities. The psychology of John's financial management during his early criminal period reveals how murder was creating new expense categories that required careful integration into his legitimate business accounting without creating suspicious patterns or unexplained costs. His handling of victim acquisition expenses, crime scene supplies, and disposal equipment all show sophisticated planning about how criminal activities could be supported through legitimate financial channels. John's interaction with law enforcement during missing person investigations of his early victims reveals how his community reputation and civic connections provided protection from serious suspicion, while his knowledge of police procedures enabled him to manage investigations without arousing further concern. His ability to present himself as a helpful community member rather than a potential suspect shows how effectively his public image served as criminal armor. The psychology of John's social life management during his early killing period reveals how murder was affecting his legitimate relationships and requiring increasingly complex performance to maintain normal appearances. His interactions with friends, family members, and business associates all required careful monitoring to ensure that psychological changes from killing didn't create behavioral inconsistencies that might generate questions or suspicion. John's development of victim storage and preservation methods reveals psychological patterns where his murders were driven by possession obsessions rather than simple elimination of threats. His careful attention to body positioning, his systematic burial procedures, and his detailed mental cataloging of victim locations all show someone whose killing was motivated by collecting and ownership needs rather than purely functional crime concealment. The psychology of John's criminal learning and adaptation during his early murders reveals how each killing provided educational opportunities that informed improvements in his methods, planning, and risk management. His analysis of what worked well, his identification of potential problems, and his systematic refinement of his criminal procedures all show someone who was approaching murder with the same continuous improvement mindset that characterized his business operations. John's use of legitimate travel and business activities to expand his victim acquisition opportunities reveals how his established social mobility and professional connections enabled criminal operations beyond his immediate geographic area while providing alibis and explanations for his presence in various locations. His ability to combine business trips with criminal activities shows sophisticated integration of his dual life components. The psychology of John's criminal confidence building during his early successful murders reveals how each killing that went undetected reinforced his belief in his ability to continue operating without consequences while strengthening his conviction that his public image provided sufficient protection from serious investigation. This growing confidence would later contribute to increasingly bold criminal behavior and risk-taking that would eventually lead to his detection. John's approach to victim selection criteria development reveals how his early murders informed the establishment of systematic targeting preferences that balanced his psychological needs with practical risk management considerations. His refinement of victim profiles, his development of acquisition location preferences, and his establishment of operational security protocols all show someone who was treating murder as a skill requiring systematic development and optimization. Understanding the psychology of John's transition to murder reveals how sophisticated social skills and community standing can actually enhance rather than prevent criminal behavior when combined with antisocial personality traits and escalating control obsessions. His case demonstrates that the most dangerous predators may be those whose legitimate success provides both access to victims and protection from investigation. The early killing psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose murders weren't impulsive acts of violence, but calculated escalations of existing criminal behavior designed to serve multiple psychological functions while maintaining the public image that had become central to his identity and criminal strategy. His ability to cross the murder threshold while continuing to function normally in business and social contexts shows compartmentalization abilities that distinguish his psychology from most serial killers. The transition to deadly violence we've analyzed represents a fundamental shift in John's criminal psychology from someone who assaulted and manipulated to someone who killed and collected, driven by escalating needs for control and possession that could no longer be satisfied through non-lethal criminal activities. This evolution shows how criminal psychology can develop and intensify over time when successful criminal behavior reinforces underlying pathological needs. The sophisticated criminal development we've explored challenges assumptions about how serial killers emerge and evolve, showing how legitimate success and community integration can provide ideal conditions for criminal escalation when combined with appropriate psychological pathology and strategic planning abilities. John's case demonstrates that the most dangerous criminals may be those who succeed rather than fail at conventional social and economic goals. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his transition to murder provides crucial context for examining how his killing career would escalate and evolve over the next decade, ultimately claiming 33 innocent lives while his public image remained largely intact. The deadly charm we've analyzed tonight became the foundation for one of criminal history's most sustained and successful killing careers. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine perhaps the most psychologically revealing aspect of his criminal behavior: his decision to bury 26 of his 33 victims in and around his suburban Chicago home, with most concentrated in the narrow crawl space beneath his house. This choice reveals profound insights into his psychology of possession, control, and the complex relationship he maintained with his victims even after death. Unlike other serial killers who dispose of bodies to eliminate evidence, John's retention of victims on his property shows how his murders were fundamentally about collection and permanent ownership rather than simple elimination of witnesses. The psychology of John's decision to use his crawl space as a burial ground reveals someone whose murders were driven by possession obsessions rather than purely functional criminal considerations. Most serial killers dispose of victims away from their homes to minimize evidence and reduce discovery risks, but John's choice to keep his victims close shows how his criminal behavior was motivated by psychological needs that outweighed practical safety concerns. His crawl space became both tomb and shrine, representing the ultimate expression of his need to maintain permanent control over his victims. John's systematic approach to crawl space excavation and preparation reveals sophisticated planning that integrated construction knowledge with criminal psychology to create the ideal environment for victim storage and his own psychological satisfaction. His careful measurement of space requirements, his installation of drainage systems, and his attention to structural integrity all show someone who was treating victim burial as a long-term project requiring careful engineering and maintenance planning. The psychology of John's burial procedures reveals ritualistic patterns that serve psychological functions beyond simple body concealment. His careful positioning of bodies, his systematic spacing of graves, and his attention to burial depth and coverage all show someone who was treating victim interment as meaningful ceremony rather than hasty disposal. These burial rituals provided ongoing psychological satisfaction and reinforced his sense of ownership and control over his victim collection. John's ability to live normally above his buried victims reveals extraordinary compartmentalization abilities that allowed him to separate his daily domestic activities from the reality of what lay beneath his floors. His continued use of his home for entertaining guests, conducting business meetings, and maintaining family relationships shows psychological detachment that enabled him to treat the crawl space deaths as completely separate from his living space activities. The psychology of John's crawl space organization reveals how he had created a systematic collection that served similar psychological functions to other types of trophy keeping but on an unprecedented scale. His mental cataloging of victim locations, his awareness of burial chronology, and his ability to navigate the crawl space to locate specific remains all show someone who was maintaining an active relationship with his victim collection rather than simply disposing of unwanted evidence. John's construction and renovation activities related to crawl space management reveal how legitimate home improvement projects provided cover for criminal infrastructure development while satisfying his psychological needs for control and optimization of his victim storage systems. His installation of ventilation fans, his drainage improvements, and his structural modifications all served dual purposes that integrated his criminal and domestic activities. The psychology of John's odor management and concealment strategies reveals sophisticated understanding of how sensory evidence could threaten his criminal operations while demonstrating his commitment to maintaining his victim collection despite practical challenges. His use of lime, his installation of air circulation systems, and his strategic use of air fresheners throughout his home all show someone who was willing to invest significant effort and resources to maintain possession of his victims. John's interaction with contractors and workers during home renovation projects reveals how his victim collection created ongoing security challenges that required careful management of access to his property while maintaining the appearance of normal home maintenance activities. His supervision of work crews, his restriction of access to certain areas, and his management of project timelines all show sophisticated planning about how to protect his criminal activities while conducting legitimate home improvements. The psychology of John's relationship with his crawl space environment reveals how this space served as both practical storage and psychological sanctuary where he could maintain private connection with his victim collection. His regular visits to the crawl space, his inspection of burial sites, and his ongoing maintenance activities all show someone who is treating this area as sacred space requiring personal attention and care. John's victim placement strategies within the crawl space reveal psychological patterns where the location and positioning of bodies serve specific functions related to his possession, psychology, and collection management needs. His systematic spacing of graves, his attention to accessibility for future visits, and his consideration of structural limitations all show careful planning about how to maximize both practical storage and psychological satisfaction from his victim arrangements. The psychology of John's crawl space expansion activities reveals how his growing victim collection created space management challenges that required innovative solutions and ongoing modification of his burial systems. His extension of burial areas into his yard, his creative use of available space, and his adaptation to capacity limitations all show someone who was treating victim storage as an evolving project requiring continuous planning and optimization. John's approach to crawl space security and concealment reveals sophisticated understanding of how to protect his victim collection from discovery while maintaining normal access for his own psychological and maintenance needs. His concealment of entry points, his management of evidence trails, and his strategies for explaining structural modifications all show careful attention to protecting his criminal activities while preserving his domestic routines. The psychology of John's crawl space as psychological territory reveals how this space represented his ultimate private domain where his true identity could be fully expressed without the performance requirements of his public personas. Unlike his business offices or social spaces where he had to maintain careful facades, the crawl space was the only environment where he could be completely authentic about his criminal psychology and victim relationships. John's burial ceremony and ritual development reveals how victim interment became meaningful psychological events that provided satisfaction and closure for each killing while creating ongoing connection between him and his collection. His systematic approach to burial procedures, his attention to grave preparation, and his post-burial activities all show someone who was treating victim disposal as sacred ritual rather than practical necessity. The psychology of John's victim revisitation patterns reveals how his crawl space burials enabled ongoing psychological relationships with his victims that continued long after their deaths. His regular inspection of burial sites, his maintenance of grave areas, and his mental interaction with buried remains all show someone who was maintaining active emotional connections with his victim collection rather than simply storing evidence. John's integration of crawl space activities with his normal domestic routines reveals extraordinary psychological compartmentalization that allowed him to treat victim maintenance as just another aspect of home ownership and property management. His scheduling of crawl space visits around family activities, his treatment of burial maintenance as routine chores, and his seamless transition between victim care and normal domestic tasks all show complete normalization of criminal activities. The psychology of John's crawl space as extension of self reveals how his property and victim collection had become integral parts of his psychological identity and self-image. His pride in his burial organization, his satisfaction with his space utilization, and his sense of accomplishment about his collection management all show someone whose criminal activities had become central to his self-worth and personal satisfaction. John's crawl space environmental management reveals sophisticated understanding of how to maintain optimal conditions for his victim collection while minimizing the practical problems that decomposition and crowding were creating. His attention to drainage, ventilation, and moisture control all show someone who was applying scientific principles to criminal activities while treating victim preservation as an important technical challenge. The psychology of John's crawl space discovery, fears, and security planning reveals how his victim collection had become both his greatest source of psychological satisfaction and his primary vulnerability to exposure and punishment. His ongoing anxiety about discovery, his security improvements, and his contingency planning all show someone who understood that his psychological needs had created enormous practical risks that required constant management. John's use of lime and chemical treatments in his crawl space reveals understanding of decomposition processes and odor control that enabled him to maintain his victim collection despite the practical challenges created by multiple bodies in a confined space. His systematic application of preservation chemicals, his attention to treatment schedules, and his monitoring of decomposition rates all show someone who was treating victim maintenance as a scientific project requiring ongoing research and optimization. The psychology of John's crawl space as private museum reveals how his burial ground serves similar psychological functions to other types of collecting behavior, but with the ultimate objects of possession: human beings who had been completely claimed and could never escape his ownership. His organization of his collection, his ability to locate specific victims, and his ongoing curation activities all show someone who was treating murder victims as valuable possessions requiring careful preservation and display. John's crawl space lighting and navigation systems reveal practical adaptations that enabled him to function effectively in his burial environment while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect his criminal activities. His installation of lighting, his creation of pathway systems, and his development of orientation methods all show careful planning about how to optimize his access to and interaction with his victim collection. The psychology of John's crawl space capacity management reveals how his growing collection eventually outgrew his available space and forced him to develop alternative disposal methods that compromised his preferred psychological pattern of keeping all victims on his property. His eventual disposal of some victims off-site shows how practical limitations could force modifications to his criminal psychology while creating additional stress and dissatisfaction. John's approach to crawl space documentation and record-keeping reveals systematic attention to maintaining accurate information about his victim collection that enabled him to track his criminal activities and manage his burial operations effectively. His mental cataloging systems, his spatial memory techniques, and his ongoing inventory management all show someone who was treating his victims as valuable assets, requiring careful record-keeping and management. Understanding the psychology of John's crawl space operation reveals how his murders were fundamentally about possession and collection rather than simple elimination of victims. His willingness to accept enormous practical risks and ongoing management challenges in order to maintain possession of his victims shows how completely his criminal behavior was driven by psychological needs for control and ownership that outweighed normal considerations about safety and evidence disposal. The crawl space psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose criminal behavior was motivated by collecting obsessions that required him to maintain permanent physical possession of his victims rather than simply eliminating them as witnesses or obstacles. This psychological pattern distinguishes his criminal behavior from most serial killers and shows how possession needs can drive criminal activities that create enormous practical challenges and security risks. The victim collection we've analyzed represents one of the most extreme examples of criminal possession psychology ever documented, showing how murders can be driven by ownership obsessions that require killers to maintain ongoing relationships with their victims even after death. John's crawl space operation demonstrates how criminal psychology can create behavioral patterns that prioritize psychological satisfaction over practical security considerations. The burial ground we've explored challenges assumptions about serial killer behavior and motivation, showing how some criminals are driven by collecting and possession needs that require them to maintain physical custody of their victims. Despite the enormous risks and practical challenges this creates, John's case demonstrates how criminal psychology can drive behavior that seems irrational from a practical perspective, but serves crucial psychological functions for the perpetrator. The underground cemetery we've examined tonight represents the ultimate expression of John's psychology of control and possession, showing how his home had become both residence and mausoleum where he could maintain permanent custody of his victims while continuing to live a normal life above ground. His crawl space operation reveals psychological patterns that distinguish his criminal behavior and provide crucial insights into how possession obsessions can drive sustained criminal careers. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his crawl space operation provides crucial context for examining how his criminal behavior escalated and eventually exceeded his ability to manage the practical challenges created by his psychological needs. The victim collection we've analyzed tonight would eventually become the evidence that exposed his criminal career and brought justice for his 33 victims. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine one of the most sophisticated aspects of his criminal psychology: his systematic approach to victim selection and acquisition. Unlike serial killers who target randomly or impulsively, John developed elaborate strategies that exploited his legitimate social positions and community connections to identify, access, and acquire victims with remarkable efficiency and minimal risk. Understanding his victim selection psychology reveals how someone with extensive community involvement and multiple public personas could weaponize their social access to prey upon society's most vulnerable members while maintaining the trust and admiration of the very communities he was victimizing. The psychology of John's victim selection criteria reveals sophisticated understanding of social vulnerability and risk assessment that combine predatory instincts with business-like analysis of opportunity and security considerations. His targeting of young men between the ages of 14 and 21 wasn't random, but reflected careful calculation about which demographic would provide optimal satisfaction of his psychological needs while minimizing his exposure to detection and prosecution. This age group represented individuals who were old enough to be sexually appealing, but young enough to be easily manipulated and controlled. John's systematic targeting of economically disadvantaged young men reveals how his business success and community knowledge provided crucial intelligence about social vulnerabilities that could be exploited for criminal purposes. His awareness of local employment patterns, his understanding of economic pressures facing young people, and his knowledge of social service limitations all informed his victim selection strategies. He understood that desperate individuals would be more likely to accept employment offers, less likely to question unusual job requirements, and less likely to be immediately missed if they disappeared. The psychology of John's use of employment offers as victim acquisition tools reveals how his legitimate business operations provided perfect cover for criminal recruitment activities while satisfying his psychological needs for control and authority over potential victims. His offers of construction work, his promises of steady employment, and his use of his business reputation to establish credibility all show how legitimate success could be weaponized for criminal victim acquisition. These employment lures weren't just deception but sophisticated manipulation of economic desperation. John's targeting of individuals who were socially isolated or disconnected from family support systems reveals predatory understanding of how social vulnerabilities could be identified and exploited to minimize investigation risks when victims disappeared. His preference for runaways, his targeting of individuals with troubled family relationships, and his selection of victims who were geographically displaced all show systematic attention to choosing victims whose disappearances would generate minimal immediate concern or sustained investigation. The psychology of John's victim acquisition through his clown persona reveals how his entertainment activities provided access to potential targets while establishing rapport and trust that could be leveraged for criminal purposes. His clown performances at community events, his interactions with young people through charitable activities, and his use of his Pogo character to appear non-threatening all serve to identify potential victims while creating opportunities for initial contact and relationship development. John's exploitation of Chicago's gay community for victim acquisition reveals sophisticated understanding of how social marginalization and discrimination could be used to identify vulnerable targets while minimizing investigation risks. His knowledge of gay bars and social venues, his understanding of the challenges facing young gay men in the 1970s, and his exploitation of social stigma surrounding homosexuality all provided access to victims who were reluctant to seek help from authorities and whose disappearances might be dismissed or inadequately investigated. The psychology of John's geographic victim selection patterns reveals systematic territorial management that balanced opportunity maximization with risk minimization by targeting individuals from areas where his business and social activities provided legitimate explanations for his presence. His preference for victims from his immediate neighborhood, his targeting of individuals from areas where he conducted business, and his avoidance of victims from communities where he had no legitimate connection all show careful planning about how to maintain plausible explanations for victim contact. John's timing strategies for victim acquisition reveal sophisticated understanding of when potential targets would be most vulnerable and when his own activities would be least suspicious to observers. His preference for evening and weekend victim contact, his coordination of criminal activities with his legitimate schedule, and his use of seasonal employment patterns to explain increased recruitment activities all show systematic planning about when victim acquisition could be conducted with optimal safety and success. The psychology of John's victim screening and evaluation processes reveals how he had developed systematic methods for assessing potential targets based on vulnerability markers, compliance indicators, and risk factors that informed his decisions about which individuals to pursue for criminal purposes. His observation of victim behavior patterns, his assessment of their social connections, and his evaluation of their likely responses to manipulation all show sophisticated victim analysis capabilities. John's use of his construction business as a victim recruitment tool reveals how legitimate employment opportunities provided ideal cover for criminal victim acquisition while serving his psychological needs for authority and control over potential targets. His hiring practices, his job interview procedures, and his workplace interactions all provided opportunities to identify vulnerable individuals while establishing the authority relationships that would later facilitate criminal control. The psychology of John's victim compliance strategies reveals sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation techniques that could be used to reduce victim resistance and increase cooperation throughout the criminal encounter process. His use of authority positioning, his exploitation of economic desperation, and his application of social pressure all show systematic approaches to victim control that had been refined through years of legitimate social and business manipulation. John's targeting of individuals involved in prostitution or survival sex work reveals predatory exploitation of extreme social and economic vulnerability while minimizing investigation risks by targeting victims whose disappearances might be attributed to the dangers inherent in their survival activities. His knowledge of street-level sex work patterns, his understanding of the vulnerabilities facing sex workers, and his exploitation of law enforcement attitudes toward prostitution all provided access to victims with minimal investigation risk. The psychology of John's victim age preferences reveals complex motivations that combine sexual attraction with practical considerations about victim controllability and investigation risk. His preference for teenagers and young adults wasn't just sexual, but reflected calculation about which age group would be most easily manipulated, most likely to accept employment offers, and least likely to be immediately missed by family or community members. John's exploitation of seasonal employment patterns and economic cycles reveals sophisticated understanding of how social and economic conditions could create optimal victim acquisition opportunities by increasing the number of vulnerable individuals seeking employment while providing legitimate explanations for increased recruitment activities. His timing of victim acquisition to coincide with construction season, his use of holiday employment needs, and his exploitation of back-to-school economic pressures all show systematic planning about when potential victims would be most available and vulnerable. The psychology of John's victim transportation and isolation strategies reveals careful planning about how to move potential victims from public spaces to private locations where criminal activities could be conducted without interference or observation. His use of his vehicle as mobile crime scene, his selection of route strategies that minimized witness exposure, and his attention to timing considerations that reduce detection risks all show sophisticated operational planning. John's development of victim trust-building techniques reveals sophisticated understanding of how to establish rapport and credibility with potential targets that would reduce their natural defensive responses and increase their willingness to comply with increasingly risky requests. His use of his business reputation, his exploitation of his community standing, and his application of his natural charisma all serve to lower victim defenses while creating psychological conditions that facilitated criminal control. The psychology of John's victim retention and control methods reveals systematic approaches to maintaining criminal control once victims had been isolated and brought to his property. His use of physical restraint, his application of psychological intimidation, and his exploitation of victim isolation all show careful planning about how to maintain control throughout criminal encounters while minimizing victim resistance and escape attempts. John's targeting of individuals with substance abuse problems reveals exploitation of addiction vulnerabilities that could be used to identify potential victims while providing explanations for their eventual disappearances that would minimize investigation intensity. His knowledge of local drug scene patterns, his understanding of addiction-related vulnerabilities, and his exploitation of social stigma surrounding substance abuse all provided access to victims whose disappearances might be attributed to addiction-related dangers. The psychology of John's victim acquisition record-keeping and tracking systems reveals systematic attention to managing his criminal operations like a business enterprise, with careful documentation of target identification, contact methods, and operational outcomes. His mental cataloging of victim information, his tracking of recruitment strategies and success rates, and his ongoing analysis of victim acquisition efficiency all show business-like approaches to criminal activity management. John's use of referral networks and victim-to-victim recruitment reveals sophisticated understanding of how existing victims could be used to identify and access additional targets while providing credibility and trust building that facilitated subsequent victim acquisition. His exploitation of victim social networks, his use of existing victims as recruiters, and his systematic expansion of victim pools through relationship exploitation all show advanced criminal networking capabilities. The psychology of John's victim disposal timing and victim replacement patterns reveals systematic approaches to managing his criminal operations that balanced his psychological needs for ongoing victim acquisition with practical considerations about investigation risks and operational security. His attention to victim disappearance timing, his management of investigation heat cycles, and his coordination of disposal and replacement activities all show sophisticated criminal operational planning. John's exploitation of his political connections and law enforcement relationships for victim acquisition intelligence reveals how his civic involvement provided access to information about missing person investigations, police procedures, and community concerns that informed his victim selection strategies. His knowledge of investigation priorities, his understanding of police resource limitations, and his awareness of community attention patterns all provided crucial intelligence for criminal planning. The psychology of John's victim selection evolution over time reveals how his criminal preferences and operational strategies adapted based on experience, changing social conditions, and evolving psychological needs, while maintaining core targeting criteria that balance satisfaction with security. His refinement of victim profiles, his adaptation to changing social conditions, and his ongoing optimization of acquisition strategies all show criminal learning and development. John's targeting of individuals from broken families or foster care systems reveals exploitation of institutional vulnerabilities and support system gaps that provided access to victims with minimal protective resources while reducing investigation risks when victims disappeared. His knowledge of child welfare system limitations, his understanding of foster care vulnerabilities, and his exploitation of family dysfunction all provided access to particularly vulnerable victim populations. Understanding the psychology of John's victim selection reveals how sophisticated social knowledge and community connections can be weaponized by individuals with criminal intent to identify and exploit society's most vulnerable members. His systematic approach to victim acquisition demonstrates how legitimate success in social integration can actually enhance criminal capabilities by providing access, credibility, and protective camouflage that enable sustained predatory careers. The victim targeting psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone who combined predatory instincts with business acumen to create systematic victim acquisition operations that exploited social vulnerabilities while minimizing detection risks. His approach to victim selection demonstrates how criminal psychology can be enhanced rather than constrained by legitimate social success and community integration. The sophisticated victim acquisition strategies we've analyzed show how John's multiple public personas and community connections provided unprecedented access to potential victims while creating layered explanations for his contact with vulnerable young people. His case demonstrates how the most dangerous predators may be those whose legitimate social positions provide both victim access and investigation protection. The systematic victim targeting we've explored challenges assumptions about serial killer behavior and victim selection, showing how some criminals develop sophisticated methodologies that treat victim acquisition as business operations, requiring systematic planning, risk assessment, and continuous optimization. John's case demonstrates how criminal psychology can evolve into complex operational systems when combined with intelligence and social access. The predatory psychology we've revealed tonight shows how John's victim selection was never random or impulsive, but represented systematic exploitation of social vulnerabilities by someone whose legitimate success provided both access to victims and protection from investigation. His targeting strategies demonstrate how criminal psychology can be enhanced by social integration rather than limited by it. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his victim selection provides crucial context for examining how he used his community standing and public reputation to avoid detection while conducting systematic predatory operations that would ultimately claim 33 innocent lives. The sophisticated hunting strategies we've analyzed tonight enabled one of criminal history's most sustained and successful predatory careers. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his criminal strategy, his systematic cultivation of community relationships and public reputation that served as powerful protection against criminal investigation and suspicion. Unlike serial killers who rely on anonymity and social invisibility to avoid detection, John created a hypervisible public persona that made criminal accusations seem incredible to those who knew him through his legitimate activities. Understanding this community camouflage psychology reveals how sophisticated criminals can weaponize social capital and public service to create nearly impenetrable shields against law enforcement scrutiny. The psychology of John's community integration strategy reveals someone who understood that being beloved and respected by his community would provide better protection than simply being unknown or ignored. His systematic cultivation of positive relationships with neighbors, business associates, civic leaders, and law enforcement officials created a network of character references who would find criminal accusations incredible and would actively defend him against suspicion. This approach represents one of the most sophisticated criminal protection strategies ever documented. John's involvement in Democratic Party politics during the 1960s and 1972 reveals how he used legitimate political participation to build relationships with law enforcement officials, elected leaders, and community influencers who would later provide crucial protection when missing person investigations begin touching on his activities. His work on political campaigns, his participation in party fundraising, and his networking with local officials all served to establish his reputation as a civic-minded citizen whose character and integrity were beyond question. The psychology of John's relationship with law enforcement officials reveals sophisticated understanding of how personal connections and community reputation could influence police attitudes and investigation priorities when criminal suspicions arose. His participation in police charity events, his support for law enforcement organizations, and his cultivation of friendships with individual officers all created psychological barriers that made serious investigation of his activities more difficult and less likely to be pursued with appropriate intensity. John's strategic use of charitable activities and community service reveals how public altruism could serve as powerful ammunition against criminal accusations while satisfying his psychological needs for attention and social control. His volunteer work with local organizations, his donations to community causes, and his participation in charitable events all created evidence of good character that could be marshaled to defend against suspicion while building the social capital that provided criminal protection. The psychology of John's civic organization involvement reveals systematic networking designed to build relationships with community leaders and establish his reputation as someone whose character and integrity were unquestionable. His participation in the JCs, his involvement in business organizations, and his membership in various civic groups all serve to expand his network of character references while demonstrating his commitment to community welfare and social responsibility. John's cultivation of his business reputation within the construction and hospitality industries reveals how professional success and industry respect could provide powerful protection against criminal suspicion while creating practical resources that supported his criminal activities. His relationships with suppliers, contractors, and business associates all serve to establish his legitimacy and respectability while providing access to materials and services that facilitated his criminal operations. The psychology of John's neighborhood relationships reveals sophisticated understanding of how local social dynamics could be managed to minimize suspicion and investigation while maintaining the domestic environment necessary for his criminal activities. His interactions with neighbors, his participation in local events, and his management of his property appearance all serve to establish his reputation as a normal, respectable homeowner whose activities were beyond suspicion. John's use of his clown persona for community protection reveals how entertainment activities serve dual functions of providing direct criminal access to victims while building public reputation that made criminal accusations seem implausible. His performances at children's hospitals, community festivals, and charitable events all created powerful evidence of his care for others and commitment to community welfare that could be used to defend against criminal suspicions. The psychology of John's media relationships and public image management reveals sophisticated understanding of how news coverage and public perception could be influenced to support his legitimate reputation while deflecting attention from criminal activities. His interactions with local journalists, his participation in community publicity events, and his strategic self-promotion all serve to build the public image that would later provide protection against criminal investigation. John's development of character witness networks reveals systematic relationship building designed to create communities of supporters who would defend his character and reputation when criminal accusations arose. His cultivation of friendships across different social spheres, his maintenance of positive relationships with former associates, and his strategic investment in social capital all created layers of protection that made criminal investigation more difficult and less credible. The psychology of John's crisis management strategies reveals how he used his community standing and social connections to deflect suspicion and redirect attention when missing person investigations began focusing on his activities. His ability to present himself as helpful community member rather than potential suspect, his use of his reputation to influence investigation direction, and his mobilization of character references all show sophisticated understanding of how social capital could be weaponized for criminal protection. John's religious and spiritual organization involvement reveals how participation in faith communities could provide powerful character evidence while expanding his network of community supporters who would find criminal accusations incredible. His attendance at religious services, his participation in church activities, and his cultivation of relationships with religious leaders all serve to establish his moral character while building additional layers of community protection. The psychology of John's professional organization memberships reveals systematic networking designed to establish his legitimacy within business and civic communities while building relationships that would provide character references and investigation protection. His participation in contractor associations, business clubs, and professional societies all serve to demonstrate his commitment to legitimate success while expanding his network of community supporters. John's strategic philanthropy and charitable giving reveals how financial contributions to community causes could serve as powerful evidence of good character while building relationships with charitable organizations and community leaders who would defend him against criminal accusations. His donations to local causes, his support for community projects, and his participation in fundraising activities all created documentation of his civic commitment that could be used for criminal protection. The psychology of John's community event participation reveals how public visibility and social engagement could provide better criminal protection than privacy or social withdrawal. His attendance at local festivals, his participation in community celebrations, and his involvement in public gatherings all serve to establish his normal social integration while creating witnesses to his apparent good character and community commitment. John's cultivation of relationships with local government officials reveals sophisticated understanding of how political connections could influence law enforcement priorities and investigation procedures when criminal suspicions arose. His interactions with city council members, his relationships with municipal employees, and his involvement in local government processes all serve to build the political capital that could provide criminal protection. The psychology of John's youth organization involvement reveals how work with children and teenagers could provide powerful character evidence while creating access to potential victims and establishing relationships with families who would defend his character. His volunteer work with youth groups, his participation in children's activities, and his cultivation of relationships with parents all serve dual purposes of victim access and reputation protection. John's strategic community investment and property development activities reveals how legitimate business success and neighborhood improvement could serve as evidence of his commitment to community welfare while providing practical cover for criminal activities. His property investments, his neighborhood improvement projects, and his contributions to local development all demonstrated his stake in community welfare while supporting his criminal operations. The psychology of John's social club memberships and recreational organization involvement reveals systematic relationship building designed to establish his normal social integration while creating networks of supporters who would defend his character against criminal accusations. His participation in social clubs, his involvement in recreational organizations, and his cultivation of leisure relationships all serve to demonstrate his normal social functioning while building criminal protection networks. John's use of family relationships and domestic stability as community protection reveals how his marriages and stepchildren served as powerful evidence of his normal social integration and moral character that could be marshaled against criminal accusations. His presentation of himself as devoted family man, his involvement in his children's activities, and his cultivation of positive relationships with extended family all serve to establish his respectability while providing character witnesses. The psychology of John's employment practices and worker relations reveals how his treatment of employees and business associates created additional character witnesses who would defend his reputation while providing practical cover for criminal victim acquisition activities. His reputation as fair employer, his relationships with construction workers, and his cultivation of positive workplace dynamics all serve to establish his good character while facilitating criminal operations. John's strategic documentation and record-keeping of his community involvement reveals sophisticated understanding of how evidence of civic engagement could be preserved and utilized for reputation defense when criminal accusations arose. His maintenance of awards and recognitions, his preservation of photographs from community events, and his systematic documentation of charitable activities all provided ammunition for character defense. The psychology of John's community crisis response and public service during emergencies reveals how his participation in disaster relief and community assistance efforts could provide powerful evidence of his care for others while building relationships with emergency responders and community leaders. His involvement in flood relief, his participation in emergency response activities, and his assistance during community crises all demonstrated his commitment to public welfare. John's cultivation of cross-community relationships and regional networking reveals sophisticated understanding of how influence and reputation could be extended beyond his immediate geographic area to provide broader protection against criminal investigation. His involvement in regional business organizations, his participation in state-level political activities, and his cultivation of relationships across municipal boundaries all serve to expand his protection network. Understanding the psychology of John's community camouflage reveals how sophisticated criminals can exploit society's assumptions about the relationship between civic involvement and moral character to create powerful protection against criminal investigation. His case demonstrates that community integration and public service don't necessarily indicate good character, but can actually provide enhanced opportunities and protection for criminal activities when managed by individuals with appropriate psychological sophistication. The community protection psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone who understood that hypervisibility and beloved public status could provide better criminal protection than anonymity or social withdrawal. His systematic cultivation of community relationships represents one of the most sophisticated criminal camouflage strategies ever documented, showing how legitimate social capital can be weaponized to support illegitimate activities. The public image management we've analyzed demonstrates how John's civic involvement and community service weren't expressions of genuine altruism, but calculated investments in social capital that would provide protection when criminal suspicions arose. His case shows how public service and community leadership can be exploited by sophisticated criminals to create nearly impenetrable shields against investigation and prosecution. The social capital weaponization we've explored challenges fundamental assumptions about the relationship between community involvement and criminal behavior, demonstrating that civic engagement and charitable activities can actually facilitate rather than prevent criminal activities when combined with appropriate psychological manipulation abilities and strategic planning. The reputation armor we've examined tonight shows how John's beloved community status created psychological barriers that made criminal accusations seem incredible to those who knew him through his legitimate activities. His case demonstrates how the most dangerous criminals may be those whose public personas are most admirable and whose community integration is most complete. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his community camouflage provides crucial context for examining how his eventual exposure occurred and why his criminal career was able to continue for so long despite numerous opportunities for earlier detection. The protective shield we've analyzed tonight would eventually prove insufficient against the accumulating evidence of his crimes, but it enabled him to operate successfully for over a decade while claiming 33 innocent lives. The sophisticated social manipulation we've revealed demonstrates how John's understanding of community psychology and social dynamics enabled him to create protective environments that served his criminal activities while satisfying his psychological needs for attention and social control. His case provides crucial insights into how legitimate social success can be corrupted to serve criminal purposes when managed by individuals with appropriate antisocial psychology and strategic planning capabilities. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine the most psychologically devastating period of his criminal career, the final months of 1978, when his carefully constructed protective systems begin failing and his sophisticated community camouflage could no longer shield him from intensifying criminal investigation. Understanding the psychology of how John responded to his crumbling facade reveals crucial insights into how individuals with complex dual identities react when their elaborate deception systems are threatened with exposure. This period shows how even the most sophisticated criminal psychology can be overwhelmed when protective mechanisms that have operated successfully for years suddenly prove inadequate against mounting evidence and changing circumstances. The psychology of John's initial response to the Robert Piest investigation reveals someone whose confidence in his protective systems had become so complete that he initially believed his community reputation and political connections would shield him from serious scrutiny even when directly connected to a missing person case. His calm demeanor during early police contacts, his willingness to allow property searches, and his continued maintenance of his normal routines all show someone who was still operating under the assumption that his public image would provide adequate protection against criminal accusations. John's behavior during the December 11, 1978 police visit to his property reveals the first signs of psychological stress as his protective systems encountered unprecedented challenge from law enforcement officials who were not deterred by his community reputation or character references. His attempts to charm the investigating officers, his efforts to redirect their attention away from his property, and his increasing agitation as the search continued all show someone whose normal social control mechanisms were proving inadequate for managing this level of official scrutiny. The psychology of John's response to the discovery of human remains on his property reveals catastrophic psychological breakdown as the foundation of his entire dual identity system. The belief that his community camouflage provided adequate criminal protection collapsed in real time. His transition from confident community leader to exposed serial killer represents one of the most dramatic psychological reversals ever documented, showing how quickly sophisticated criminal psychology can disintegrate when core protective beliefs are destroyed. John's attempts to maintain control and manage the investigation even after the discovery of bodies reveals persistent psychological patterns where his natural manipulation instincts continued to operate despite the obvious futility of further deception. His efforts to explain the presence of remains, his attempts to minimize the scope of his criminal activities, and his continued use of charm and social skills all show how deeply ingrained his manipulation psychology had become and how difficult it was for him to abandon these patterns even when they were clearly ineffective. The psychology of John's community support network collapse reveals how quickly his carefully cultivated relationships and reputation could be destroyed when confronted with undeniable evidence of his criminal activities. His former supporters' rapid distancing from him, his character witnesses' shocked withdrawal of support, and his political connections' immediate abandonment all show how conditional his community protection had always been and how completely his social capital could be destroyed by criminal exposure. John's interaction with media during the initial stages of his exposure reveals sophisticated understanding of public perception management combined with desperate attempts to salvage some version of his public image even after criminal discovery. His strategic cooperation with journalists, his careful framing of his situation, and his attempts to present himself as victim rather than perpetrator all show how his manipulation psychology adapted to crisis conditions while maintaining some hope of public sympathy or understanding. The psychology of John's family relationships during his exposure reveals complex dynamics where his need for emotional support conflicted with his protective instincts toward family members who were also being devastated by his criminal revelation. His interactions with his wife, his relationships with his stepchildren, and his management of extended family reactions all show how criminal exposure affects not just perpetrators, but entire family systems that have been unknowingly supporting criminal activities. John's workplace and business relationship management during his exposure reveals how his criminal revelation affected not just his personal relationships, but his entire professional network and economic foundation. His employees' reactions to discovering their employer's criminal activities, his business partners' responses to the exposure, and his contractors' shocked realization about the nature of his home renovation projects all show how criminal exposure can destroy entire professional ecosystems. The psychology of John's neighbor relationships during the discovery period reveals how his criminal activities had been affecting his immediate community in ways that became apparent only after his exposure. His neighbors' realization about the source of unusual odors, their recognition of suspicious activities they had previously dismissed, and their horror at discovering they had been living adjacent to a mass grave all show how criminal activities can impact entire neighborhoods while remaining hidden from conscious awareness. John's attempts to manage legal representation and criminal defense strategies reveal how his business mindset and control psychology applied to legal crisis management, while his understanding of public relations informed his approach to damage control and reputation management. His selection of defense attorneys, his cooperation strategies with legal counsel, and his approach to plea negotiations all show how his sophisticated strategic thinking adapted to legal rather than criminal operational challenges. The psychology of John's interaction with law enforcement officials during intensive interrogation reveals how his manipulation skills and social intelligence operated under extreme pressure, while his protective psychological mechanisms gradually broke down under sustained official scrutiny. His responses to questioning, his strategic revelation of information, and his attempts to maintain some level of control over the investigation process all show how his criminal psychology adapted to custody and interrogation conditions. John's approach to victim identification cooperation reveals complex psychological dynamics where his need for attention and recognition as an expert on his own crimes conflicted with strategic considerations about legal exposure and community reaction. His willingness to provide detailed information about his victims, his apparent satisfaction from demonstrating his criminal expertise, and his cooperation with identification procedures all show how his narcissistic psychology found new outlets even during criminal prosecution. The psychology of John's property and evidence management during the investigation reveals how the discovery process affected his relationship with the physical spaces and material evidence that had been central to his criminal psychology and victim collection activities. His reactions to the excavation of his crawl space, his responses to the removal of his victim collection, and his apparent emotional detachment from the destruction of his criminal infrastructure all show how his possession psychology adapted to complete loss of control. John's community reaction management and public relations strategies during his exposure reveal sophisticated understanding of how public perception could still be influenced even after criminal discovery, showing persistent manipulation psychology that continued operating despite obvious futility. His strategic media interactions, his careful framing of his situation, and his attempts to generate public sympathy all show how his social manipulation instincts continued functioning during crisis conditions. The psychology of John's religious and spiritual exploration during his exposure reveals how criminal revelation and community rejection created psychological pressures that drove him towards spiritual resources and religious explanations for his behavior. His interactions with chaplains, his discussions of faith and morality, and his apparent spiritual searching all show how crisis conditions can activate previously dormant psychological resources and coping mechanisms. John's approach to maintaining relationships with remaining supporters reveals how criminal exposure affects the psychology of both perpetrators and their support networks, creating complex dynamics where mutual need for connection conflicts with social pressures and moral revulsion. His management of remaining friendships, his cultivation of supportive correspondence, and his strategic relationship maintenance all show how criminal psychology adapts to extreme social isolation and rejection. The psychology of John's daily routine management during incarceration and legal proceedings reveals how someone whose entire existence had been organized around maintaining multiple public personas adapted to environments where such performance was no longer possible or effective. His adjustment to jail conditions, his management of court appearances, and his adaptation to media scrutiny all show how his psychological systems functioned when stripped of their normal operational contexts. John's approach to maintaining control over his narrative and public image during legal proceedings reveals persistent psychological patterns where his need for attention and recognition found new outlets through criminal notoriety and legal celebrity. His strategic cooperation with documentary producers, his participation in psychological studies, and his cultivation of relationships with true crime enthusiasts all show how his manipulation psychology found new applications even during prosecution. The psychology of John's reaction to community and victim family responses reveals how criminal exposure affected his understanding of the human impact of his activities, while his emotional detachment mechanisms protected him from full appreciation of the suffering he had caused. His responses to victim impact statements, his reactions to community outrage, and his apparent inability to experience genuine remorse all show how his psychological defenses operated during confrontation with the consequences of his criminal behavior. John's management of his legacy and historical reputation during his exposure reveals sophisticated understanding of how his case would be remembered and studied, showing persistent narcissistic psychology that found satisfaction in criminal notoriety when legitimate fame was no longer possible. His cooperation with researchers, his strategic revelation of information, and his careful management of his criminal reputation all show how his attention-seeking psychology adapted to infamous rather than admirable recognition. Understanding the psychology of John's exposure and discovery reveals how even the most sophisticated criminal camouflage systems can eventually be overwhelmed by accumulating evidence and changing circumstances that exceed their protective capacity. His case demonstrates that community reputation and social capital, while powerful criminal protection tools, have limits that can be exceeded when criminal activities reach certain thresholds of evidence and official attention. The facade collapse we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose entire psychological identity had become so dependent on his public image and community standing that criminal exposure created fundamental identity crisis requiring complete psychological reconstruction. His response to discovery shows how criminals with sophisticated dual identity systems react when their protective mechanisms fail and their hidden activities are exposed to public scrutiny. The protection system failure we've analyzed demonstrates how John's sophisticated community camouflage, while remarkably effective for over a decade, ultimately proved inadequate against the combination of physical evidence, official investigation, and community pressure that characterized his final exposure. His case shows how criminal psychology that depends on external validation and social acceptance becomes particularly vulnerable when those support systems are withdrawn. The psychological breakdown we've explored reveals how John's criminal discovery affected not just his individual psychology, but entire networks of relationships, community connections, and social systems that had unknowingly supported his criminal activities. His exposure demonstrates how criminal revelation can create ripple effects that extend far beyond the immediate perpetrator to affect entire communities and social networks. The identity collapse we've examined tonight shows how John's carefully constructed public personas provided powerful criminal protection until they became liabilities that increased rather than decreased his legal exposure and social rejection. His case demonstrates how sophisticated criminal camouflage can become self-defeating when evidence accumulates beyond the capacity of social protection systems to deflect or minimize. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his exposure and discovery provides crucial context for examining his behavior during legal proceedings and his psychological adaptation to the complete destruction of the dual identity system that had enabled his criminal career. The facade crumbling we've analyzed tonight marked the end of his successful criminal operations and the beginning of his transformation from respected community leader to infamous serial killer. The sophisticated protection system collapse we've revealed demonstrates how John's understanding of community psychology and social dynamics, while remarkably effective for criminal concealment, ultimately proved insufficient against the accumulated evidence and official scrutiny that characterized his final exposure. His case provides crucial insights into the limitations of social camouflage as criminal protection and the inevitable vulnerabilities that sophisticated criminal psychology creates for itself through sustained criminal operations. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine one of the most psychologically revealing periods of his criminal career, his extensive interrogation by law enforcement officials following his arrest and the discovery of bodies on his property. Understanding how John's sophisticated manipulation skills and social intelligence operated under intense official scrutiny provides crucial insights into how individuals with complex criminal psychology adapt their behavioral strategies when their normal environmental controls are removed and they must function under extreme pressure while facing the complete destruction of their carefully constructed public identities. The psychology of John's initial interrogation responses reveals someone whose entire adult existence had been built around controlling social interactions and managing other people's perceptions of him. Now facing the unprecedented challenge of professional interrogators who were immune to his charm and armed with overwhelming physical evidence of his criminal activities, his early attempts to maintain his normal social manipulation patterns, his efforts to establish rapport with investigating officers, and his strategic use of cooperation and resistance all show how his criminal psychology adapted to custody conditions while maintaining core behavioral patterns. John's approach to information management during interrogation reveals sophisticated understanding of how strategic revelation and concealment could be used to maintain some level of control over legal proceedings while satisfying his psychological needs for attention and recognition as an expert on his own criminal activities. His careful dosing of confessions, his strategic withholding of specific details, and his tactical cooperation with certain aspects of the investigation all show how his business management skills applied to legal crisis management and damage control strategies. The psychology of John's relationship dynamics with interrogating officers reveals how his natural charisma and social intelligence continued to operate even under extreme legal pressure, while his understanding of authority relationships informed his strategies for managing official interactions. His attempts to establish personal connections with investigators, his use of humor and charm to reduce tension, and his strategic expressions of cooperation and remorse all show how his manipulation psychology adapted to law enforcement rather than civilian social contexts. John's confession patterns and narrative construction during interrogation reveal complex psychological dynamics where his need for control over his story conflicted with legal strategic considerations about admissibility and potential punishment. His careful framing of his criminal activities, his strategic emphasis on certain motivations while minimizing others, and his apparent satisfaction from providing detailed accounts of his expertise all show how his narcissistic psychology found outlets through criminal confession and expertise demonstration. The psychology of John's emotional presentation during interrogation reveals sophisticated performance skills that enabled him to present specific emotional states designed to influence interrogator perceptions and legal outcomes while maintaining psychological distance from genuine emotional engagement. With the impact of his criminal activities, his strategic displays of remorse, his calculated expressions of cooperation, and his apparent emotional breakdowns all show how his performance psychology adapted to legal rather than entertainment contexts. John's approach to victim identification cooperation during interrogation reveals complex motivations where his desire for attention and recognition as criminal expert conflicted with practical considerations about legal exposure and community reaction. His willingness to provide detailed information about victim selection, his apparent pride in his criminal sophistication, and his strategic revelation of disposal methods all show how his attention-seeking psychology found expression through cooperation with criminal investigation. The psychology of John's legal strategy discussions during interrogation reveals how his business mindset and strategic planning abilities applied to defense preparation, while his understanding of public relations informed his approach to managing media coverage and community perception. His participation in defense planning, his strategic cooperation with legal counsel, and his apparent intellectual engagement with legal procedures all show how his problem-solving psychology adapted to criminal defense rather than business operational challenges. John's interaction patterns with different types of interrogators reveals sophisticated social intelligence that enabled him to adapt his approach based on individual personality assessment and professional role recognition. His different responses to detectives versus FBI agents, his varied approaches to male versus female interrogators, and his strategic adjustment to formal versus informal questioning contexts all show how his social manipulation skills continued operating under legal pressure while adapting to professional law enforcement environments. The psychology of John's timeline construction and chronological organization during confession reveals how his systematic business management approach to record keeping and operational planning applied to criminal disclosure, while his attention to details served both legal cooperation and personal psychological needs for organization and control. His ability to reconstruct victim sequences, his systematic approach to location identification, and his detailed operational descriptions all show how his administrative psychology operated during criminal revelation. John's use of psychological deflection and responsibility distribution during interrogation reveals sophisticated understanding of how criminal culpability could be managed through strategic framing of motivations, circumstances, and mental state considerations. His emphasis on childhood trauma, his discussions of alcohol influence, and his strategic positioning of himself as victim of circumstances all show how his manipulation psychology adapted to legal responsibility management and mitigation strategies. The psychology of John's relationship with physical evidence during interrogation reveals how his confrontation with undeniable proof of his criminal activities affected his psychological defenses and strategic options, while his business problem-solving approach applied to damage control and limitation strategies. His responses to crime scene evidence, his reactions to victim identification procedures, and his strategic cooperation with forensic analysis all show how his criminal psychology adapted to evidential rather than testimonial challenges. John's approach to media management and public perception during the interrogation period reveals persistent attention to reputation control and narrative management even after his criminal exposure, showing how his public relations psychology continued operating despite obvious futility. His strategic cooperation with certain journalists, his careful framing of his legal situation, and his apparent concern about public perception all show how his image management psychology persisted during criminal prosecution. The psychology of John's family relationship management during interrogation reveals complex dynamics where his protective instincts toward family members conflicted with his needs for emotional support and legal assistance, while his manipulation skills applied to managing family reactions and maintaining supportive relationships. His interactions with his wife during questioning, his management of family media exposure, and his strategic use of family sympathy all show how his relationship psychology adapted to crisis conditions. John's approach to mental health evaluation and psychological assessment during interrogation reveals sophisticated understanding of how psychiatric testimony could be used for legal advantage, while his intellectual curiosity about his own psychology provided genuine engagement with clinical evaluation processes. His cooperation with psychiatric evaluation, his strategic presentation during psychological testing, and his apparent interest in clinical conclusions all show how his analytical psychology engaged with professional mental health assessment. The psychology of John's confession verification and detail validation during interrogation reveals how his need for recognition as criminal expert drove him to provide extensive corroborating evidence that served both investigative needs and his psychological requirements for attention and expertise demonstration. His detailed crime scene descriptions, his systematic operational explanations, and his apparent pride in his criminal sophistication all show how his narcissistic psychology found expression through criminal expertise revelation. John's management of interrogation fatigue and psychological pressure reveals sophisticated stress management techniques that enabled him to maintain performance capacity during extended questioning. While his business experience with high-pressure negotiations informed his strategies for managing official scrutiny, his pacing of cooperation and resistance, his strategic use of breaks and delays, and his apparent ability to compartmentalize stress all show how his professional psychology applied to interrogation, endurance, and performance management. The psychology of John's relationship with legal representation during interrogation reveals complex dynamics where his need for control conflicted with professional legal advice, while his business experience with professional consultants informed his approach to attorney-client relationships and strategic planning. His cooperation with defense counsel, his strategic information sharing with attorneys, and his apparent intellectual engagement with legal strategy all show how his professional relationship psychology operated during criminal defense preparation. John's approach to plea negotiation and sentencing considerations during interrogation reveals sophisticated understanding of legal processes combined with strategic thinking about outcome optimization. While his business negotiation experience informed his approach to legal deal-making and compromise strategies, his participation in plea discussions, his strategic cooperation with sentencing preparation, and his apparent calculation about punishment mitigation all show how his negotiation psychology applied to criminal legal contexts. The psychology of John's institutional adjustment and custody adaptation during the interrogation period reveals how someone whose entire existence had been organized around social freedom and control adapted to detention conditions while maintaining psychological equilibrium and strategic focus. His management of jail routines, his interaction with custody staff, and his adaptation to restricted environments all show how his adaptability psychology functioned under extreme constraint and pressure. John's use of interrogation sessions for psychological expression and emotional outlet reveals how criminal confessions serve therapeutic functions by providing opportunities for authentic self-expression that had been impossible during his years of maintaining false public personas. His apparent satisfaction from honest discussion of his criminal psychology, his engagement with detailed operational description, and his obvious pleasure from expertise demonstration all show how confession provided psychological relief from years of concealment and performance. The psychology of John's future planning and post-conviction preparation during interrogation reveals persistent strategic thinking about long-term outcomes and reputation management, even while facing certain prosecution and likely execution. His discussions of appeal strategies, his planning for continued media engagement, and his apparent interest in his historical legacy all show how his long-term planning psychology continued operating despite immediate legal crisis. Understanding the psychology of John's interrogation behavior reveals how sophisticated social manipulation skills can continue operating even under extreme legal pressure while adapting to professional law enforcement environments that are specifically designed to resist criminal deception and manipulation. His case demonstrates how individuals with complex criminal psychology maintain core behavioral patterns even when their normal environmental controls are completely removed. The interrogation psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose sophisticated social intelligence and manipulation abilities provided remarkable resilience during legal crisis. While his business experience with high-pressure situations informed his strategic approaches to damage control and outcome optimization, his performance during questioning shows how criminal psychology adapts to legal rather than social challenges while maintaining core patterns of control-seeking and attention-demanding behavior. The custody adaptation we've analyzed demonstrates how John's management skills and strategic thinking abilities enabled him to maintain psychological equilibrium and strategic focus even while facing the complete destruction of his public identity and certain criminal prosecution. His case shows how individuals with sophisticated criminal psychology can maintain functionality and strategic capacity even under extreme legal and social pressure. The manipulation persistence we've explored reveals how John's social influence abilities continued operating during interrogation while adapting to professional law enforcement contexts that were specifically designed to resist criminal deception and charm. His case demonstrates how deeply ingrained manipulation psychology can be and how it continues functioning even when its normal effectiveness is neutralized by professional interrogation techniques. The strategic cooperation we've examined tonight shows how John's confession and victim identification assistance served multiple psychological functions, including attention-seeking, expertise, demonstration, and control maintenance, while also providing practical legal advantages through cooperation, credit, and sentencing mitigation. His case demonstrates how criminal psychology can find outlets and satisfaction even during prosecution and punishment processes. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his interrogation behavior provides crucial context for examining his trial performance and his psychological adaptation to conviction and sentencing. The manipulation under pressure we've analyzed tonight shows how his sophisticated social skills continued operating until the very end of his legal proceedings, maintaining core patterns even when facing ultimate consequences for his criminal activities. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine the final arena where his sophisticated manipulation skills and performance psychology would be tested: his criminal trial proceedings from February to March 1980. Understanding how John approached his trial reveals crucial insights into how individuals with complex criminal psychology adapt their behavioral strategies when facing ultimate consequences while maintaining their fundamental need for control and attention. His courtroom behavior represents the final expression of the performance psychology that had characterized his entire adult life, now applied to the ultimate stakes of life and death in a legal setting specifically designed to resist manipulation and deception. The psychology of John's pre-trial preparation and legal strategy development reveals someone who approached his criminal defense with the same systematic planning and strategic thinking that had characterized his business operations and criminal activities. His extensive consultation with defense attorneys, his detailed review of evidence and witness lists, and his strategic planning for courtroom presentation all show how his analytical psychology and problem-solving abilities adapted to legal rather than criminal operational challenges while maintaining his fundamental need to control outcomes and manage perceptions. John's selection of his legal defense strategy reveals complex psychological dynamics where his need to maintain some version of his public image conflicted with practical legal considerations about optimal defense approaches. His initial resistance to insanity defense strategies, his preference for maintaining his intellectual competence and rational decision-making capacity, and his apparent concern about being perceived as mentally ill all show how his narcissistic psychology and self-image management needs influenced legal strategy decisions that might not have been optimal for achieving acquittal or avoiding execution. The psychology of John's courtroom demeanor and presentation reveals sophisticated understanding of how judicial proceedings could be used as performance opportunities, while his natural charisma and social intelligence adapted to formal, legal rather than informal social contexts. His careful attention to appearance and dress, his strategic use of eye contact and body language, and his calculated expressions of emotion and remorse all show how his performance psychology found new outlets through courtroom theater and legal presentation. John's interaction patterns with his defense attorneys reveals complex relationship dynamics where his need for control conflicted with professional legal advice while his business experience with professional consultants informed his approach to attorney management and strategic oversight. His attempts to direct his own defense, his strategic cooperation and resistance with legal counsel, and his apparent intellectual engagement with legal procedures all show how his management psychology operated during criminal defense while maintaining patterns of authority and control-seeking behavior. The psychology of John's response to prosecution evidence presentation reveals how his confrontation with systematic documentation of his criminal activities affected his psychological defenses and strategic options, while his analytical abilities enabled him to engage intellectually with forensic evidence and witness testimony. His reactions to crime scene photographs, his responses to victim identification procedures, and his apparent emotional detachment from graphic evidence all show how his compartmentalization psychology functioned during legal rather than personal confrontation with his criminal activities. John's approach to witness testimony and cross-examination reveals sophisticated understanding of how courtroom procedures could be influenced through strategic cooperation and resistance, while his social intelligence informed his assessment of witness credibility and jury perception. His responses to prosecution witnesses, his strategic cooperation with defense testimony, and his apparent calculation about testimony impact all show how his manipulation psychology adapted to formal legal rather than informal social influence contexts. The psychology of John's interaction with victim family members during trial proceedings reveals complex emotional dynamics where his limited capacity for empathy conflicted with his strategic understanding of how family impact could influence jury perception and sentencing outcomes. His responses to victim impact testimony, his apparent emotional reactions to family confrontations, and his strategic expressions of remorse and responsibility all show how his performance psychology attempted to manage human tragedy and suffering for legal advantage. John's management of media attention and public perception during trial reveals persistent attention to reputation control and narrative management, even while facing certain conviction and likely execution. His strategic cooperation with certain journalists, his careful framing of his legal situation, and his apparent satisfaction from continued public attention all show how his publicity psychology found outlets through criminal notoriety when positive recognition was no longer possible. The psychology of John's jury selection awareness and courtroom audience management reveals sophisticated understanding of how legal proceedings could be influenced through strategic presentation and performance, while his entertainment experience informed his approach to audience engagement and perception management. His apparent attention to jury reactions, his strategic modification of behavior based on courtroom responses, and his calculated use of emotional displays all show how his performance psychology adapted to legal rather than entertainment contexts. John's approach to expert testimony and psychiatric evaluation presentation reveals complex dynamics where his intellectual curiosity about his own psychology conflicted with strategic considerations about legal responsibility and punishment mitigation. His cooperation with defense psychiatric experts, his strategic presentation during psychological evaluation, and his apparent interest in clinical conclusions all show how his analytical psychology engaged with professional mental health testimony while maintaining strategic focus on legal outcomes. The psychology of John's response to prosecution arguments and legal theory reveals how his understanding of criminal responsibility and moral culpability had been affected by years of maintaining dual identities, while his business experience with negotiation and persuasion informed his assessment of legal argumentation effectiveness. His reactions to prosecution characterizations, his apparent engagement with legal theory, and his strategic responses to criminal responsibility arguments all show how his intellectual psychology functioned during legal rather than business analytical challenges. John's courtroom emotional regulation and stress management reveals sophisticated psychological control techniques that enabled him to maintain performance capacity during extreme legal pressure. while his business experience with high-stakes presentations informed his approach to courtroom endurance and presentation consistency. His management of emotional displays, his strategic use of breaks and delays, and his apparent ability to compartmentalize stress all show how his professional psychology applied to legal performance and pressure management. The psychology of John's relationship with courtroom personnel and judicial authority reveals how his understanding of hierarchy and authority relationships adapted to formal legal rather than business or social contexts, while his manipulation skills attempted to influence court personnel through charm and cooperation. His interactions with bailiffs and court staff, his strategic cooperation with judicial directives, and his apparent respect for legal authority all show how his authority relationship psychology functioned during formal legal proceedings. John's approach to sentencing considerations and punishment acceptance reveals complex psychological dynamics where his strategic thinking about outcome optimization conflicted with psychological denial about the reality of execution. While his business planning experience informed his approach to consequence management and mitigation strategies, his participation in sentencing hearings, his strategic cooperation with mitigation efforts, and his apparent intellectual engagement with punishment theory all show how his planning psychology operated during ultimate consequence confrontation. The psychology of John's final statement opportunities and courtroom messaging reveals how his need for attention and recognition found expression through formal legal platforms, while his understanding of historical significance informed his approach to legacy management and public narrative control. His strategic use of allocution rights, his careful framing of final messages, and his apparent satisfaction from continued public attention all show how his publicity psychology adapted to legal rather than entertainment or business contexts. John's interaction with alternative defense strategies and plea consideration reveals sophisticated understanding of legal options combined with psychological resistance to strategies that would compromise his self-image or intellectual competence. While his business experience with deal-making informed his approach to legal negotiation and compromise assessment, his evaluation of plea alternatives, his strategic cooperation with sentence negotiation, and his apparent calculation about outcome optimization all show how his negotiation psychology applied to ultimate legal decision-making. The psychology of John's courtroom performance consistency and strategic adaptation reveals how his entertainment and business presentation experience enabled him to maintain effective performance throughout extended legal proceedings while adapting his approach based on ongoing assessment of audience reaction and strategic effectiveness. His consistency of demeanor, his strategic modification of presentation, and his apparent ability to maintain focus all show how his performance psychology sustained effectiveness during prolonged legal challenge. John's approach to conviction acceptance and appeal preparation reveals persistent strategic thinking about long-term outcomes and continued legal engagement even while facing certain criminal conviction and likely execution. His intellectual engagement with appeal prospects, his strategic cooperation with post-conviction legal preparation, and his apparent interest in continued legal proceedings all show how his planning psychology continued operating despite immediate legal defeat and certain punishment. The psychology of John's legacy, management, and historical positioning during trial reveals sophisticated understanding of how his criminal case would be remembered and studied. While his narcissistic psychology found satisfaction in criminal notoriety and continued public attention, his strategic cooperation with court historians, his apparent interest in documentary coverage, and his careful management of his criminal reputation all show how his attention-seeking psychology adapted to infamous rather than admirable recognition. Understanding the psychology of John's trial performance reveals how sophisticated manipulation skills and performance abilities can continue operating even during formal legal proceedings, specifically designed to resist criminal deception and influence, while providing final outlets for attention-seeking and control psychology when facing ultimate consequences. His case demonstrates how individuals with complex criminal psychology maintain core behavioral patterns even when confronting certain conviction and likely execution. The courtroom psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose sophisticated performance abilities and strategic thinking provided remarkable resilience during legal crisis, while his business and entertainment experience informed his approaches to presentation, management, and audience influence in formal legal rather than informal social contexts. His trial behavior shows how criminal psychology adapts to ultimate legal challenges while maintaining fundamental patterns of control-seeking and attention-demanding behavior. The legal performance we've analyzed demonstrates how John's management skills and presentation abilities enabled him to maintain psychological effectiveness and strategic focus even while facing the complete destruction of his public identity and certain criminal punishment. His case shows how individuals with sophisticated criminal psychology can maintain functionality and strategic capacity even when confronting ultimate legal and social consequences. The manipulation persistence we've explored reveals how John's social influence abilities continued operating during formal legal proceedings while adapting to judicial contexts that were specifically designed to resist criminal charm and deception. His case demonstrates how deeply ingrained performance psychology can be and how it continues functioning even when normal effectiveness is neutralized by legal procedures and professional judicial management. The final control attempts we've examined tonight show how John's courtroom behavior served multiple psychological functions, including attention-seeking, legacy management, and narrative control, while also providing final outlets for the performance psychology that had characterized his entire adult existence. His case demonstrates how criminal psychology can find expression and satisfaction even during prosecution and conviction processes when other outlets for attention and control have been eliminated. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his trial performance provides crucial context for examining his post-conviction behavior and his psychological adaptation to death row conditions. The final manipulation attempts we've analyzed tonight represent the conclusion of his public performance career and the transition to his final psychological phase as condemned prisoner awaiting execution while maintaining his fundamental patterns of attention-seeking and control psychology until the very end. The sophisticated courtroom adaptation we've revealed demonstrates how John's understanding of performance and presentation psychology enabled him to maintain strategic effectiveness even during formal legal proceedings designed to resist criminal manipulation, showing how criminal psychology can adapt to any context while maintaining core patterns of behavior and psychological need satisfaction that persist regardless of circumstances or consequences. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy continues, we now examine perhaps the most psychologically revealing period of his existence, his 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center, where he was completely stripped of the community connections, business success, and public personas that had defined his entire adult identity. Understanding how John's psychology functioned when deprived of his sophisticated social manipulation opportunities reveals crucial insights into the core personality patterns that had driven his criminal behavior and how individuals with complex performance psychology adapt when their external validation systems are permanently removed. The psychology of John's initial adjustment to prison life reveals someone experiencing profound identity crisis, as the elaborate persona system that had sustained his self-image and provided psychological satisfaction for decades was suddenly and permanently eliminated. His transition from beloved community leader to despised death row inmate represents one of the most dramatic psychological reversals ever documented, forcing him to reconstruct his entire sense of self without access to the social feedback and external validation that had been central to his psychological functioning since childhood. John's adaptation to the physical restrictions and social isolation of death row reveals sophisticated psychological flexibility that enabled him to maintain mental equilibrium despite the complete elimination of his normal environmental controls and social manipulation opportunities. His development of new daily routines, his adjustment to confined living spaces, and his acceptance of restricted social interaction all show how his adaptability psychology functioned when forced to operate within extremely limited parameters while maintaining core patterns of attention-seeking and control psychology. The psychology of John's relationship dynamics with correctional staff reveals how his manipulation skills and social intelligence adapted to institutional rather than community contexts, while his understanding of authority relationships informed his strategies for managing official interactions and maintaining some level of personal agency within the prison system. His interactions with guards and administrators, his strategic cooperation and resistance with institutional rules, and his cultivation of staff relationships all show how his manipulation psychology found new applications in correctional rather than business or social environments. John's approach to fellow death row inmates and prison social hierarchy reveals sophisticated understanding of how institutional dynamics could be navigated and influenced through strategic relationship building, while his natural charisma continued to operate even in environments specifically designed to minimize social interaction and influence opportunities. His cultivation of inmate relationships, his participation in prison social networks, and his management of his celebrity status within the correctional system all show how his social psychology adapted to criminal rather than legitimate social contexts. The psychology of John's creative outlets and artistic expression during incarceration reveals how his need for attention and recognition found new channels through painting and creative activities that provided both psychological satisfaction and continued opportunities for public engagement through his artwork sales and media coverage. His development of his clown painting series, his systematic approach to artistic production, and his strategic management of his artistic reputation all show how his creativity served both therapeutic and attention-seeking functions during imprisonment. John's management of his correspondence and external communication reveals persistent attention to maintaining public relationships and influence despite his physical isolation, showing how his publicity psychology adapted to written rather than face-to-face interaction, while his strategic thinking informed his approach to media management and public narrative control from prison. His extensive letter writing, his strategic cooperation with journalists and researchers, and his careful cultivation of supportive correspondence all show how his relationship management psychology continued operating despite incarceration. The psychology of John's legal appeal activities and post-conviction proceedings reveals how his strategic thinking and problem-solving abilities found outlets through continued legal engagement, while his business experience with complex negotiations informed his approach to appellate strategy and legal relationship management. His participation in appeal preparation, his strategic cooperation with post-conviction attorneys, and his ongoing engagement with legal procedures all show how his planning psychology continued operating despite the obvious futility of avoiding execution. John's approach to religious and spiritual exploration during imprisonment reveals complex psychological dynamics where his confrontation with mortality and moral accountability created pressures that drove him toward spiritual resources, while his manipulation psychology influenced his interactions with chaplains and religious counselors. His participation in religious services, his discussions of faith and morality, and his apparent spiritual searching all show how crisis conditions activated previously unexplored psychological resources while remaining filtered through his fundamental manipulation patterns. The psychology of John's media relationships and interview participation during imprisonment reveals how his need for attention and recognition found outlets through criminal notoriety and continued public fascination with his case, while his understanding of publicity management informed his strategic approach to media cooperation and narrative control. His participation in television interviews, his cooperation with documentary producers, and his strategic revelation of information all show how his publicity psychology adapted to infamous rather than admirable recognition. John's daily routine management and institutional adaptation reveals sophisticated psychological organization that enabled him to maintain mental stability and purposeful activity despite the extreme restrictions and social isolation of death row conditions. His development of exercise routines, his systematic approach to reading and education, and his creation of meaningful daily activities all show how his organizational psychology functioned when stripped of external responsibilities and social obligations that had previously structured his existence. The psychology of John's relationship with his execution date and mortality confrontation reveals complex psychological defenses that enabled him to maintain functionality and strategic thinking despite the certainty of death, while his planning psychology continued operating even when focused on ultimate rather than immediate outcomes. His apparent emotional detachment from execution procedures, his continued long-term planning despite obvious futility, and his strategic approach to final preparations all show how his psychological mechanisms adapted to ultimate rather than temporary challenges. John's interaction with true crime enthusiasts and academic researchers reveals how his narcissistic psychology found satisfaction through scholarly attention and intellectual engagement with his own criminal case, while his analytical abilities enabled him to contribute to research and understanding of his own psychological patterns. His cooperation with psychological studies, his participation in criminal behavior research, and his apparent intellectual curiosity about his own pathology all show how his attention-seeking psychology found outlets through academic rather than popular recognition. The psychology of John's artwork production and creative expression reveals how his artistic activities served multiple psychological functions, including emotional outlet, attention-seeking behavior, and income generation. While his systematic approach to artistic production showed continued application of his business and organizational skills to creative rather than criminal enterprises, his prolific painting output, his strategic management of artwork sales, and his cultivation of artistic reputation all show how his productivity psychology found new applications during incarceration. John's management of his celebrity status within the prison system reveals sophisticated understanding of how criminal notoriety could be leveraged for practical advantages and social influence, even within correctional environments designed to minimize such disparities. His use of his fame for commissary privileges, his strategic sharing of celebrity benefits, and his cultivation of protective relationships all show how his social intelligence continued operating within institutional rather than community contexts. The psychology of John's family relationship maintenance during imprisonment reveals complex dynamics where his need for emotional support conflicted with his protective instincts toward family members, while his manipulation skills influenced his strategies for maintaining supportive relationships despite the social stigma of his criminal activities. his correspondence with remaining family members, his management of family media exposure, and his strategic use of family connections all show how his relationship psychology adapted to restricted rather than normal family interaction patterns. John's approach to death row culture and institutional traditions reveals how his social intelligence enabled him to understand and navigate correctional community dynamics, while his leadership psychology found outlets through influence over fellow inmates and participation in institutional social networks. His participation in death row traditions, his influence over institutional social dynamics, and his strategic positioning within prison hierarchies all show how his leadership psychology adapted to criminal rather than legitimate organizational contexts. The psychology of John's philosophical and intellectual development during imprisonment reveals how his analytical abilities and intellectual curiosity found outlets through reading, writing, and philosophical exploration, while his educational activities provided both personal satisfaction and continued opportunities for attention and recognition through intellectual achievement. His extensive reading programs, his philosophical discussions with correspondents, and his apparent intellectual growth all show how his learning psychology continued operating despite physical restrictions and social isolation. John's management of his historical legacy and cultural impact reveals sophisticated understanding of how his criminal case would be remembered and studied, while his narcissistic psychology found satisfaction in continued public attention and academic interest in his psychological patterns. His strategic cooperation with historians and biographers, his careful management of his criminal narrative, and his apparent satisfaction from continued cultural relevance all show how his legacy psychology adapted to infamous rather than admirable historical significance. The psychology of John's response to execution procedures and final preparations reveals how his psychological defenses and emotional regulation systems operated when confronting ultimate mortality, while his strategic thinking continued functioning even when focused on death rather than life outcomes. His apparent calm during execution preparations, his strategic approach to final statements and interviews, and his continued attention to public perception all show how his performance psychology persisted until the very end of his existence. Understanding the psychology of John's prison years reveals how sophisticated social manipulation abilities and performance psychology can continue operating even when completely stripped of their normal environmental supports and social contexts. His case demonstrates that fundamental personality patterns persist even under extreme restrictions and can find new outlets and expressions when traditional channels are eliminated, showing remarkable psychological adaptability combined with consistent core behavioral patterns. The prison psychology we've examined tonight reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose sophisticated manipulation skills and attention-seeking behaviors found new applications and outlets even during 14 years of death row isolation, demonstrating how deeply ingrained these psychological patterns had become and how effectively they could adapt to radically changed circumstances while maintaining their essential characteristics and functions. The institutional adaptation we've analyzed shows how John's social intelligence and strategic thinking enabled him to maintain psychological effectiveness and personal agency even within correctional systems specifically designed to minimize such capabilities, while his creativity and intellectual abilities found new channels for expression and satisfaction when traditional outlets were eliminated. The identity reconstruction we've explored reveals how John's psychology adapted to the complete elimination of his elaborate persona system by finding new sources of attention and recognition while maintaining core patterns of manipulation and control-seeking behavior that had characterized his entire adult existence, showing remarkable psychological resilience and adaptability under extreme circumstances. The death row psychology we've examined tonight demonstrates how John's fundamental personality patterns persisted and found expression even when facing certain execution and complete social rejection, maintaining his attention-seeking and manipulation psychology until the very end while adapting to circumstances that would have overwhelmed less sophisticated criminal psychology. As we continue our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, understanding his prison years provides crucial insights into how core personality patterns persist and adapt even under extreme restriction and social isolation, revealing the fundamental stability of complex criminal psychology even when all supporting environmental factors have been eliminated and normal outlets for psychological satisfaction have been permanently removed. The sophisticated psychological adaptation we've revealed demonstrates how John's manipulation abilities and performance psychology found new contexts and applications even during incarceration, showing how criminal psychology can maintain its essential characteristics and functions even when operating under extreme constraints and facing ultimate consequences for past criminal behavior. As our psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy approaches its conclusion, we now examine the extensive clinical analysis conducted by forensic psychologists, psychiatrists, and criminal behavior experts who studied his case in unprecedented detail. The professional assessment of John's psychology represents one of the most comprehensive examinations of dual personality criminal behavior ever conducted, providing crucial insights into how sophisticated manipulation abilities and community integration can coexist with extreme antisocial pathology. Understanding these expert conclusions reveals the complex diagnostic picture that emerged from studying someone whose criminal psychology operated successfully within normal social contexts for over a decade. The psychology of John's formal psychiatric evaluations reveals a complex diagnostic challenge that confounded traditional categories of mental illness and personality disorders, showing how sophisticated criminal behavior can emerge from combinations of disorders rather than single, easily identifiable conditions. Multiple forensic psychiatrists who examined John extensively found someone whose psychological pathology existed at the intersection of antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic traits, and sophisticated social intelligence that enabled him to function successfully in society while conducting horrific criminal activities. Dr. Richard Rappaport's comprehensive psychological assessment of John revealed someone with profound antisocial personality disorder combined with remarkable social intelligence and manipulation abilities that distinguished his psychology from typical antisocial individuals who struggle with conventional social functioning. His analysis showed how John's childhood emotional trauma had created psychological deficits that were compensated for through the development of sophisticated performance abilities and social manipulation skills that enabled successful community integration while facilitating criminal behavior. The psychology of John's antisocial personality disorder diagnosis, confirmed by multiple forensic experts, reveals someone whose capacity for empathy, guilt, and genuine emotional connection had been severely impaired while his intellectual and social functioning remained highly sophisticated. Expert analysis showed classic patterns of antisocial personality disorder, including manipulative behavior, lack of genuine remorse, disregard for social norms, and inability to learn from negative consequences, but combined with unusual levels of social success and community integration. Dr. Helen Morrison's extensive psychological evaluation of John revealed someone whose personality structure had been fundamentally organized around performance and deception from early childhood, creating psychological systems that enabled him to maintain multiple contradictory identities without apparent internal conflict or psychological distress. Her analysis emphasized how John's emotional development had been so severely impaired that his entire adult psychology functioned as elaborate performance designed to conceal fundamental psychological emptiness and emotional dysfunction. The psychology of John's narcissistic personality traits, as analyzed by forensic experts, reveals how his profound need for attention and admiration had driven the development of his multiple public personas while creating psychological pressures that contributed to his criminal behavior. Expert analysis showed how his narcissistic psychology required constant external validation and recognition that his legitimate achievements couldn't fully satisfy, creating psychological needs that criminal behavior helped fulfill through the attention and notoriety that his crimes eventually generated. John's cognitive functioning assessment, conducted through extensive psychological testing, revealed above-average intelligence combined with sophisticated reasoning abilities and exceptional social intelligence that enabled him to understand and manipulate complex social systems while maintaining successful business operations and community relationships. Expert analysis showed how his intellectual capabilities had been applied to criminal planning and risk management rather than being protective factors against criminal behavior. The psychology of John's compartmentalization abilities, as studied by clinical experts, reveals extraordinary psychological mechanisms that enabled him to maintain completely separate identity systems without apparent internal conflict or cognitive dissonance. Forensic analysis showed how John could transition seamlessly between his roles as businessman, community leader, entertainer, and serial killer without the psychological stress or behavioral inconsistencies that would normally result from such fundamental identity conflicts. Dr. George Palermo's forensic psychiatric evaluation revealed John as someone whose sexual pathology and control obsessions had become completely integrated with his social manipulation abilities to create sophisticated predatory psychology that could operate successfully within normal community contexts. His analysis emphasized how John's criminal behavior served multiple psychological functions simultaneously, including sexual gratification, power satisfaction, and resolution of identity conflicts that made killing psychologically necessary rather than simply desired. The psychology of John's childhood development, as reconstructed through extensive clinical analysis and family history review, reveals how multiple risk factors, including emotional neglect, physical abuse, identity confusion, and family dysfunction had combined to create conditions for extreme antisocial development while driving the creation of elaborate false personas designed to gain the approval and acceptance that his family environment had denied him. Expert analysis of John's victim selection psychology reveals sophisticated understanding of social vulnerability and predatory calculation that distinguished his criminal behavior from impulsive or opportunistic violence. Forensic experts identified systematic targeting strategies that exploited social marginalization, economic desperation, and institutional vulnerabilities while demonstrating careful risk assessment and operational planning that reflected business-like approaches to criminal activity. The psychology of John's community camouflage strategies, as analyzed by criminal behavior experts, reveals one of the most sophisticated criminal concealment systems ever documented, showing how legitimate social success can be weaponized to provide protection against criminal investigation. Expert analysis identified systematic reputation building, strategic relationship cultivation, and careful image management that created nearly impenetrable shields against suspicion while providing practical support for criminal operations. Dr. Dorothy Otno-Lewis's psychological assessment of John revealed someone whose entire personality structure had been organized around concealing fundamental psychological deficits through elaborate performance and social manipulation that had become so sophisticated and automatic that he may have lost conscious awareness of his own authentic emotional states and psychological needs. Her analysis emphasized how John's psychology had become a complex system of masks with no authentic core identity remaining beneath the performance layers. The psychology of John's criminal escalation patterns, as studied by forensic experts, reveals how his early success with sexual assault and manipulation had created psychological reinforcement that drove increasingly serious criminal behavior when non-lethal activities no longer provided adequate satisfaction for his escalating control and possession needs. Expert analysis showed predictable progression patterns that might have enabled intervention if properly recognized and addressed. Expert analysis of John's business success psychology reveals how his legitimate achievements served multiple functions beyond simple financial gain to encompass identity validation, criminal camouflage, and practical support for illegal activities. Forensic experts identified how John's professional success had become integral to his overall criminal strategy rather than being separate from or protective against his antisocial behavior patterns. The psychology of John's clown persona, as analyzed by performance psychology experts, reveals sophisticated understanding of how entertainment and costume could serve both therapeutic and predatory functions by providing legitimate outlets for hidden personality aspects while enabling access to potential victims and building community reputation that protected criminal activities. Expert analysis showed how the clown identity had become central to John's overall psychological management system. Dr. Cleckley's style analysis of John's psychology reveals classic mask of sanity patterns where sophisticated social functioning and apparent normalcy concealed profound psychological pathology and complete absence of genuine emotional connection or moral development. Expert assessment showed how John represented an extreme example of how antisocial personality disorder can present in highly functional rather than obviously disturbed individuals. The psychology of John's family relationship patterns, as analyzed through clinical family systems review, reveals how his marriages and parental roles had served primarily instrumental functions related to image management and social camouflage, rather than genuine emotional connection or family commitment. Expert analysis showed how John's family relationships had been systematically exploited to support his public persona while providing practical cover for criminal activities. Expert analysis of John's legal competency and criminal responsibility reveals someone who was legally sane and fully aware of the wrongfulness of his actions despite his severe personality pathology, demonstrating the important distinction between mental illness and legal insanity that many people misunderstand. Forensic experts concluded that John's sophisticated planning and concealment efforts proved his understanding of legal and moral boundaries, even while choosing to violate them. The psychology of John's response to treatment attempts and therapeutic intervention, as analyzed by clinical experts, reveals how his personality pathology was so deeply embedded in his core identity structure that conventional therapeutic approaches were largely ineffective and may have been exploited by him for manipulation, training, and social intelligence enhancement. Expert analysis suggested that John's psychology was fundamentally resistant to change due to its integration with his survival and success strategies. Dr. Robert Hare's psychopathy assessment of John using the PCLR scale reveals extremely high scores indicating severe psychopathic traits, including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, grandiose self-worth, and complete absence of genuine remorse or emotional connection. Expert analysis showed how John's psychopathy was enhanced rather than limited by his social intelligence and community success, making him particularly dangerous and difficult to detect. The psychology of John's institutional behavior and prison adaptation, as analyzed by correctional psychology experts, reveals how his manipulation abilities and social intelligence continued operating even under extreme restriction, while his fundamental personality patterns remained stable despite complete environmental change. Expert analysis showed how John's psychology maintained its essential characteristics even when stripped of normal outlets and opportunities for expression. Expert analysis of John's cultural impact and media psychology reveals how his case challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between community integration and criminal behavior, while demonstrating how sophisticated manipulation abilities can exploit society's trust and institutional vulnerabilities. Forensic experts identified how John's psychology represented a particularly dangerous form of criminal behavior that could operate successfully within normal social contexts. The psychology of John's comparative analysis with other serial killers reveals unique patterns of community integration and social success that distinguished his criminal psychology from more typical cases of social isolation and obvious dysfunction. Expert analysis showed how John's case expanded understanding of how antisocial personality disorder can present in highly functional individuals who achieve rather than fail at conventional social and economic goals. Understanding the expert psychological analysis of John Wayne Gacy reveals how sophisticated social intelligence and manipulation abilities can coexist with severe antisocial personality disorder to create particularly dangerous individuals who can operate successfully in society while conducting horrific criminal activities. The clinical assessment of his case provides crucial insights into how dual identity criminal psychology develops and functions, while challenging traditional assumptions about the relationship between mental illness and social functioning. The expert conclusions we've examined tonight represent decades of clinical experience and research applied to one of criminal psychology's most complex cases, providing authoritative insights into how sophisticated manipulation abilities and community integration can mask, rather than prevent extreme criminal pathology. These professional assessments offer crucial guidance for understanding and potentially identifying similar cases before they reach such devastating conclusions. The clinical analysis we've reviewed demonstrates how John's psychology challenged traditional diagnostic categories and treatment approaches while providing unprecedented insights into how antisocial personality disorder can present in highly functional individuals whose criminal behavior is enhanced rather than limited by their social success and community integration. The forensic expert opinions we've explored reveal John Wayne Gacy as someone whose case fundamentally expanded understanding of criminal psychology and dual identity pathology while demonstrating how the most dangerous individuals may be those whose public personas are most admirable and whose community integration is most complete. The psychological expertise applied to John's case represents the most comprehensive clinical analysis of dual personality criminal behavior ever conducted, providing crucial insights into how sophisticated criminal psychology can develop and operate, while offering important lessons for mental health professionals, law enforcement, and society about recognizing and understanding the potential for extreme criminal behavior in apparently successful and well-integrated individuals. As we prepare for our final segment examining John's legacy and the broader implications of his case, the expert analysis we've reviewed tonight provides the scientific foundation for understanding how his psychological patterns developed, operated, and ultimately created one of criminal history's most sophisticated and devastating cases of community camouflage serial murder. As our comprehensive psychological exploration of John Wayne Gacy reaches its conclusion, we now examine the profound and lasting impact his case has had on our understanding of criminal psychology, community vulnerability, and the sophisticated ways that extreme antisocial behavior can hide within normal society. John's case represents far more than just another serial killer investigation. It fundamentally challenged assumptions about how dangerous individuals present themselves and operate within communities, forever changing how law enforcement, mental health professionals, and society approach the identification and prevention of sophisticated criminal behavior. The psychology of John Wayne Gacy's lasting impact on criminal profiling reveals how his case became a foundational study for understanding how serial killers can successfully integrate into society while conducting sustained criminal careers. His sophisticated use of legitimate social success as criminal camouflage provided law enforcement with crucial insights into how predatory individuals can exploit community trust and institutional vulnerabilities to avoid detection while systematically victimizing vulnerable populations. This knowledge has fundamentally altered how investigators approach cases involving respected community members and has enhanced the ability to recognize warning signs before criminal behavior reaches devastating conclusions. John's case has permanently altered how society understands the relationship between community standing and criminal potential, challenging the fundamental assumption that civic involvement, business success, and charitable activity indicate moral character or eliminate criminal risk. His systematic exploitation of community trust and social capital for criminal protection has provided crucial lessons about how appearances can deceive and how the most dangerous individuals may be those who seem most admirable and socially integrated rather than obviously disturbed or marginalized. The psychology of how John's case influenced institutional safeguards and background investigation procedures reveals how his exploitation of employment opportunities and volunteer positions to access victims led to fundamental changes in how organizations screen individuals who work with vulnerable populations. His case demonstrated how professional success and community reputation could mask predatory intentions, leading to enhanced screening procedures, improved supervision protocols, and better understanding of how institutional vulnerabilities can be exploited by sophisticated predators. John's case has profoundly influenced how mental health professionals approach the assessment and understanding of antisocial personality disorder, particularly in highly functional individuals whose social success and community integration mask their psychological pathology. His psychology demonstrated how antisocial traits can coexist with remarkable social intelligence and manipulation abilities, leading to improved diagnostic tools and enhanced understanding of how personality disorders can present in individuals who achieve rather than fail at conventional social and economic goals. The psychology of John's impact on victim advocacy and protection services reveals how his systematic targeting of marginalized and vulnerable individuals highlighted the need for enhanced support systems and protection protocols for populations that are often overlooked or undervalued by mainstream society. His case demonstrated how predators exploit social vulnerabilities and institutional gaps, leading to improved services for at-risk youth, enhanced missing person investigation procedures, and better coordination between social services and law enforcement agencies. John's case has significantly influenced how law enforcement approaches investigations involving respected community members, providing crucial lessons about how criminal suspicion must be evaluated based on evidence rather than social standing or community reputation. His ability to deflect investigation through his civic involvement and political connections led to improved investigation protocols that are less susceptible to social influence and more focused on systematic evidence evaluation regardless of suspect social status. The psychology of how John's case changed understanding of dual identity pathology reveals how his sophisticated compartmentalization abilities and multiple persona management provided unprecedented insights into how individuals can maintain contradictory identity systems without apparent psychological conflict. His case has become a crucial study for understanding how extreme psychological compartmentalization enables criminal behavior while maintaining normal social functioning, providing important lessons for recognizing and understanding similar patterns in other cases. John's case has fundamentally altered how society approaches the relationship between childhood trauma and adult criminal behavior, demonstrating how early emotional neglect and family dysfunction can drive the development of sophisticated false personas designed to gain approval and acceptance that normal emotional development failed to provide. His psychology revealed how childhood trauma can create not just withdrawal and isolation but hypercompensation through excessive social engagement and performance that masks underlying psychological damage while creating conditions for criminal behavior. The psychology of John's impact on business and professional communities reveals how his case changed understanding of how legitimate success can be weaponized for criminal purposes when achieved by individuals with appropriate psychological pathology and strategic planning abilities. His systematic exploitation of business relationships, professional networks, and commercial success for criminal facilitation and protection has provided crucial lessons about recognizing warning signs and implementing safeguards in professional environments. John's case has significantly influenced how correctional institutions manage high-profile inmates and individuals with sophisticated manipulation abilities, providing important lessons about how personality traits that enable criminal success can continue operating within institutional environments and create ongoing management challenges. His prison behavior demonstrated how antisocial individuals adapt their manipulation strategies to institutional contexts while maintaining core patterns of attention-seeking and control psychology throughout incarceration. The psychology of John's impact on media coverage and public discourse about criminal behavior reveals how his case challenged sensationalized portrayals of serial killers as obviously disturbed individuals, providing more realistic understanding of how extreme criminal behavior can emerge from apparently normal and successful individuals. His case demonstrated the importance of responsible reporting that educates the public about real warning signs rather than perpetuating misleading stereotypes about how dangerous individuals present themselves. John's case has profoundly influenced academic research into criminal psychology and antisocial behavior, becoming one of the most studied cases in the fields of forensic psychology and criminology. His sophisticated dual identity system and community integration strategies have provided researchers with unprecedented opportunities to study how extreme antisocial behavior can coexist with social success, leading to enhanced theoretical understanding and improved practical applications for criminal behavior prediction and prevention. The psychology of John's impact on political and civic organizations reveals how his case changed approaches to volunteer screening and leadership evaluation within community groups, political parties, and charitable organizations. His exploitation of civic involvement and political connections for criminal protection led to enhanced awareness of how such positions can be sought and used by individuals with ulterior motives, resulting in improved screening procedures and oversight mechanisms. John's case has significantly influenced how families and communities respond to the revelation that respected members have engaged in extreme criminal behavior, providing important lessons about the psychological impact of such discoveries on entire social networks and the importance of providing support for those who unknowingly supported criminal activities through their trust and assistance. The psychology of John's comparative impact alongside Jeffrey Dahmer's case reveals how these two contemporary serial killers represented opposite approaches to criminal psychology and social integration, providing crucial insights into the full spectrum of how antisocial behavior can manifest and operate within society. While Dahmer represented the isolated, withdrawn criminal who avoided social contact, John demonstrated how the hyper-integrated, socially successful criminal could be equally or more dangerous through their enhanced access to victims and protection from investigation. John's case has fundamentally altered understanding of victim vulnerability and predatory targeting strategies, demonstrating how systematic exploitation of social marginalization, economic desperation, and institutional gaps can provide sustained access to victims while minimizing investigation risks. His targeting strategies have informed improved protection protocols and enhanced awareness of how social vulnerabilities can be identified and exploited by sophisticated predators. The psychology of John's legacy in forensic science and criminal investigation reveals how his case advanced techniques for processing complex crime scenes, managing multiple victim cases, and conducting investigations involving individuals with extensive community connections and potential evidence concealment capabilities. His criminal methodology provided important learning opportunities that have enhanced investigative capabilities and forensic procedures. John's case has profoundly influenced how society approaches the balance between community trust and appropriate skepticism, providing crucial lessons about maintaining healthy suspicion and verification procedures without becoming paranoid or eliminating the social cooperation that enables functional communities. His exploitation of community trust has informed better approaches to maintaining social cohesion while implementing appropriate safeguards against exploitation. Understanding John Wayne Gacy's psychological legacy reveals how his case fundamentally expanded our comprehension of human potential for both sophisticated social integration and extreme antisocial behavior, demonstrating that these characteristics are not mutually exclusive, but can coexist in ways that create particularly dangerous and difficult to detect criminal psychology. His case provides crucial insights that continue to inform efforts to protect society from individuals whose criminal intent is masked by social success and community standing. The comprehensive psychological analysis we have conducted over these 13 segments reveals John Wayne Gacy as someone whose case challenges fundamental assumptions about criminal behavior while providing unprecedented insights into how sophisticated manipulation abilities and community integration can enable, rather than prevent, extreme antisocial activities. His psychology demonstrates how childhood trauma and identity dysfunction can drive the creation of elaborate false personas that provide both social success and criminal camouflage. The lasting impact we have examined shows how John's case has influenced virtually every aspect of how society approaches criminal behavior, from law enforcement investigation procedures to mental health assessment techniques to community protection protocols. His psychology continues to inform efforts to identify and prevent similar cases while providing crucial lessons about the importance of evidence-based rather than assumption-based approaches to criminal behavior assessment. The psychological journey we have completed tonight reveals how John's sophisticated dual identity system and community manipulation strategies created one of criminal history's most devastating examples of hidden evil operating within normal society. His case demonstrates that the most dangerous individuals may be those whose public personas are most admirable and whose community integration is most complete, requiring enhanced vigilance and improved detection capabilities. The lessons learned from John Wayne Gacy's psychology extend far beyond criminal justice to encompass broader understanding of human nature, social vulnerability, and the complex ways that psychological trauma can manifest in adult behavior. His case provides crucial insights into how societies can better protect their most vulnerable members while maintaining the trust and cooperation that enable functional communities. As we conclude our exploration of John Wayne Gacy's psychology, we are left with both horror at what he accomplished and gratitude for the insights his case has provided into the darkest possibilities of human behavior, through understanding how his sophisticated criminal psychology developed and operated, we gain crucial knowledge that can help prevent similar tragedies and protect future potential victims from individuals whose charm and social success mask predatory intentions. The mind we have explored over these many hours represents one of the most sophisticated examples of criminal psychology ever documented, showing how intelligence, charisma, and social success can be corrupted to serve the most evil purposes when combined with severe personality pathology and strategic criminal planning. Yet, through understanding John's psychological patterns, we strengthen our ability to recognize and respond to similar threats before they can cause such devastating harm. Thank you for joining us on this comprehensive psychological exploration into one of criminal history's most complex and disturbing minds. The insights gained from understanding John Wayne Gacy's psychology continue to inform efforts to protect society from individuals whose sophisticated social camouflage masks predatory intentions, helping to ensure that such devastating criminal careers become increasingly difficult to sustain and more likely to be detected before reaching such tragic conclusions.